Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Relax, close your eyes, and enjoy tonight's true, scary stories with gentle rain. If you enjoy the journey, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you dare. I need to tell you about the summer my family rented an old house for 2 weeks, because even now, years later, I still get a strange feeling in my chest when I think about it. It wasn't a haunted house in the way you see in movies, with creaking gates and dead trees out front. From the outside, it looked almost charming, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard advertising a peaceful countryside getaway. Tall windows, a wraparound porch, wooden floors that groaned pleasantly under your feet. But the moment we stepped inside for the first time, something about it felt off, like the air itself was thicker than it should have been, like the walls were holding their breath. My parents had booked it for a short vacation, a place to unwind before the school year started again. It sat a little away from the nearest town, surrounded by tall oak trees that blocked most of the sunlight in the late afternoon. The owner, an older man who barely said more than a few words when he handed over the keys, mentioned that the house had been in his family for generations. He didn't tell us anything strange about it, no warnings, no odd looks, nothing that would have made us think twice. He just handed over the keys, told us where the fuse box was, and left. For the first few days, everything was normal. We explored the property, found an old shed out back filled with rusted tools, and spent our evenings sitting on the porch, listening to the crickets. My little sister loved the tire swing that hung from one of the oak trees, and my mom kept saying how peaceful it was compared to our usual noisy neighborhood back home. My dad, ever the practical one, spent most of his time checking that everything in the house worked properly, testing light switches, checking water pressure, making sure the old fireplace wasn't a fire hazard. It was during one of these little inspections that he mentioned something about the upstairs bathroom door. The door had this odd swelling to it, the kind you get in old houses where the wood has absorbed moisture over decades and never quite dried out right. It didn't sit flush in its frame anymore. To close it, you had to push it hard, almost forcing it into the jamb, until you heard that satisfying click of the latch catching. My dad warned all of us about it that first night at dinner. Just so you know, that bathroom door upstairs is a pain. You've got to shove it to get it shut. And the knob's a little tricky too, so don't lock yourself in there by accident. We all laughed it off at the time. It seemed like such a small, mundane detail, the kind of thing you'd forget about within a day. But it turned out to be more than just an inconvenient door. What none of us realized until later was that the doorknob itself didn't actually control the latch properly. You could turn the knob all you wanted, twist it left, twist it right, and nothing would happen. The latch, once it caught, stayed caught, completely indifferent to whatever the knob was doing. It was like the knob and the latch had stopped speaking to each other years ago. Two separate mechanisms trapped in the same piece of hardware, no longer working together the way they were designed to. On the fourth day of our stay, my parents decided to drive into town to pick up groceries and maybe grab lunch somewhere. My sister went with them because she wanted to see the little bakery my mom had mentioned, the one with a window full of pastries that had caught her eye when we drove past it on our first day. I decided to stay behind. I wasn't in the mood for the drive, and honestly, I liked the idea of having the house to myself for a couple of hours. It felt like a small adventure, being trusted to hold down the fort while everyone else went out. I spent the first hour just lounging around, flipping through channels on the old television that got maybe 5 stations if you angled the antenna just right, and reading a few pages of a book I'd brought along but hadn't touched all week. The house was quiet, in that particular way old houses are quiet. Not silent exactly, but full of small sounds. The settling of wood, the occasional creak from somewhere upstairs, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on and off. None of it bothered me. I had grown used to the house's noises over the past few days, the way you get used to a stranger's habits after spending enough time around them. Eventually, I decided to take a shower. It was warm outside, and I figured I'd rinse off before everyone got back, so we could maybe head out to explore the little creek behind the property later that evening. I climbed the stairs, walked down the hallway, and pushed open the bathroom door. Out of habit, more than anything else, I did what my dad had shown us. I pulled the door shut behind me, put my shoulder into it slightly, and pushed until I heard that click. It was second nature by now. I hadn't even thought twice about it. The shower itself was unremarkable. The water pressure was decent. The little bar of soap the owner had left smelled like lavender, and I took my time, in no particular rush since I had the house to myself. When I finished, I wrapped a towel around myself and reached for the doorknob to head back to my room and get dressed. The knob turned in my hand, smooth as always, but the door didn't budge. I frowned, thinking maybe I hadn't turned it far enough, and tried again. Still nothing. I pulled harder this time, bracing my foot against the little rug on the floor for leverage, and the door held firm, as solid as if it had been nailed shut. That's when it clicked in my head. The memory of my dad's warning at the dinner table a few nights before. The knob didn't control the latch. I had locked myself in without even realizing that's what I was doing. For a minute or two, I wasn't really worried. It felt almost funny, the kind of situation you'd laugh about later, the kind of story you'd tell your friends about the one time I got stuck in a bathroom. I tried the knob a few more times, jiggling it, turning it slowly, turning it fast, hoping maybe I'd just been unlucky with the angle. Nothing worked. The latch stayed exactly where it was, stubborn and unmoving, completely unbothered by my efforts. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, towel still wrapped around me, and thought about my options. My phone was in my room, useless to me now. I could yell for help, but I knew nobody was home. My parents and sister had left maybe 2 hours earlier, and knowing how my mom liked to browse every aisle of a grocery store like she was searching for buried treasure, I figured they'd be gone for a while longer still. I thought about trying to pick the lock somehow, but there was nothing in the bathroom that seemed useful for that. Just towels, a half-empty bottle of shampoo, and a small window that was far too narrow for me to fit through, even if I wanted to try climbing out of it, which, given how high up we were, wasn't exactly an appealing idea anyway. So I waited. I sat there, in that unfamiliar bathroom, listening to the pipes occasionally groan somewhere in the walls, watching the little bit of afternoon light shift slowly across the tile floor as time passed. It's strange how different a house feels when you're stuck in one small room of it, unable to see or move anywhere else. Every sound outside that door seemed to matter more than it should have. Every creak of the house settling made me sit up a little straighter, listening, hoping it might be the front door opening, my family finally coming home. I don't know exactly how long I sat there. Maybe 40 minutes, maybe closer to an hour. Long enough that the excitement of the situation had faded into a kind of dull irritation, mixed with a growing hope that someone would come home soon so I could stop sitting on the edge of a bathtub in a towel like some kind of prisoner in my own vacation house. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the side door downstairs slamming shut. Relief washed over me immediately. I recognized that door. We'd all been using it more than the front door since it was closer to where we usually parked. It had a particular heaviness to its slam, a deep thud that echoed slightly through the lower floor of the house. I knew that sound. I'd heard it multiple times over the past few days. My dad especially had a habit of letting it swing shut a little too hard behind him, something my mom teased him about constantly. "Dad." I called out, leaning toward the door. "Dad, I'm stuck in here. I'm locked in the bathroom." I waited, listening carefully, and sure enough, I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps, moving across what I recognized as the kitchen floor. That particular creak of the hardwood near the stove that always announced itself whenever anyone walked over it. The footsteps continued, moving through what would have been the hallway connecting the kitchen to the front of the house. Each step landing with an even, unhurried rhythm. "Dad." I called again, louder this time, more insistent. "I'm stuck. The door won't open." The footsteps stopped, right at the bottom of the staircase, exactly where I would have expected them to stop if my dad had heard me and paused to figure out where my voice was coming from. There was a brief moment of silence, the kind of pause you'd expect from someone standing still, listening, orienting themselves before heading toward the sound of a voice calling for help. "Dad, I'm locked in the bathroom." I shouted again, my voice carrying that particular edge of frustration that comes from having repeated yourself one too many times. And then the footsteps moved again, faster now, taking the stairs two at a time from the sound of it. A quick rhythmic thumping that climbed up toward the second floor with real urgency. I felt a small wave of relief at that, at hearing him hurry, at knowing he'd understood and was coming to help me. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped again, just for a moment, as if getting their bearings on the second floor, figuring out which direction the bathroom was in relation to where they now stood. "I'm locked in the bathroom." I called out one more time, just to make sure, just to guide him toward exactly where I was, since the upstairs hallway had a couple of doors close together, and I didn't want him wasting time trying the wrong one. 4 more steps. I heard them clearly, 4 distinct footfalls moving down the hallway, getting closer, closer, until they stopped right outside the bathroom door. I could practically picture him standing there on the other side, examining the door, probably remembering the warning he'd given us all just days before about how stubborn the latch could be. "Dad?" I said, quieter this time, since he was right there now, close enough that I didn't need to shout anymore. There was no verbal answer. No "hang on, I've got it," or "yeah, I remember this door's tricky," or any of the things you'd expect someone to say in that moment. Just silence. Just the awareness of a presence standing on the other side of that door, close enough that I could almost feel it despite the wood separating us. And then, without any further warning, the door exploded open. I mean that quite literally. There was no gentle turning of a knob, no careful jiggling, no gradual working of the latch, just a massive, sudden force that sent the door swinging wide open with a boom so loud and violent that it slammed into the wall behind it, the doorknob punching a small dent into the drywall from the impact. The sound of it was almost deafening in that small, enclosed space, a crash that seemed far too big, far too powerful for what should have been a simple opening of a stuck bathroom door. I flinched at the noise, my whole body reacting before my mind had even caught up with what had happened. And then I stepped forward, out of the bathroom into the hallway, ready to thank my dad for coming to my rescue, for hearing me and rushing up those stairs and forcing that stubborn door open with what must have been considerable effort. Except there was nobody there. I stood in that empty hallway, towel still wrapped around me, looking left and right, expecting to see my dad standing there, maybe catching his breath from the exertion of forcing the door open, maybe already turning to head back downstairs now that he'd solved my little problem. But the hallway was completely empty. No one to my left, no one to my right, no sound of footsteps retreating down the stairs, no closing of any other door. Nothing. Just me. alone, standing in that hallway with a broken door hanging open behind me and a fresh dent in the wall where the knob had struck it. I felt a chill run through me, the kind that has nothing to do with temperature, the kind that starts somewhere deep in your stomach and spreads outward until your skin prickles with it. I thought back through every sound I had just heard. The side door slamming shut downstairs, footsteps through the kitchen, through the hallway, pausing at the base of the stairs, climbing up quickly, pausing again at the top, 4 steps down the hall to reach me, and then that violent, forceful opening of a door that shouldn't have been possible to open that easily, not with a stuck latch like that one had. Every single sound had been exactly what I would have expected if my dad really had come home and rushed upstairs to help me. Every pause, every footstep, every moment of hesitation had matched perfectly with what a real person moving through that house would have sounded like. And yet there was no one there. No car in the driveway when I eventually looked out the window. No sign that anyone had come or gone. My family wouldn't return for at least another 20 minutes, based on the time I later confirmed when they finally did walk through the front door, laughing about something my sister had said in the car, completely unaware of what had happened while they were gone. I didn't scream. I didn't run through the house in a panic, though looking back, maybe I should have. Instead, I just stood there for a moment, processing what had happened, feeling that strange mixture of fear and something almost like exhaustion settle over me. And then, in a moment that even now I can't fully explain, I found myself saying, quite politely, almost automatically, "Thank you." I don't know why those were the words that came out of my mouth. Maybe some instinct told me that whatever had helped me out of that bathroom, whatever force had heard my calls and responded to them with such precision, such attentiveness to my exact words, deserved some kind of acknowledgement. Maybe I was just too rattled to think of anything else to say. But I said it, quiet and sincere, into that empty hallway, and then I walked straight to my room, got dressed, and climbed into bed even though it was still the middle of the afternoon. I didn't tell my parents what happened that day, not right away. When they got home and asked how my time alone had gone, I just said it was quiet, that I'd taken a shower and relaxed for a bit. I wasn't ready to explain what I'd experienced, partly because I wasn't sure how to put it into words that wouldn't sound completely unbelievable, and partly because some part of me wanted to hold on to it privately for a while, to turn it over in my mind before sharing it with anyone else. It wasn't until our last night in that house, sitting around the dinner table with the strange quiet of our impending departure hanging over us, that I finally told them everything. My dad's face went pale as I described the sequence of footsteps, the pause at the stairs, the pause outside the door, the violent way it had finally swung open. He confirmed that he and my mom and sister had still been in town at that exact time, nowhere near the house, and that none of them had come back early or left again without telling me. We never did find out what or who had been in that house with me that afternoon. The owner, when my dad cautiously brought it up before we left, just gave a strange, knowing sort of smile, and said that old houses sometimes had their own way of taking care of the people staying in them, and left it at that, refusing to elaborate any further no matter how many questions we asked. I think about that hallway sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and I hear an unexpected creak somewhere in the walls. I think about those footsteps, so deliberate, so careful in the way they paused and listened and responded exactly to my voice, guiding themselves toward me with a precision that felt almost tender in its attentiveness, right up until that final violent burst of force that tore the door open. I think about standing in that empty hallway, looking for someone who wasn't there, who had never been there in any way I could see or touch or explain. And I think about the fact that, despite the fear, despite the confusion. Despite everything strange and unsettling about that afternoon, my first instinct had been gratitude. Whatever had been in that house with me, whatever had heard a scared kid calling out for help and had come, step by careful step, all the way up those stairs and down that hallway to force open a door that no ordinary hand should have been able to open so easily, it had helped me. And somewhere deep down, beneath all the fear, I think I still believe that saying thank you was exactly the right thing to do. One of my brothers used to work security at one of New York City's most upscale hotels, the kind of place with marble lobbies and uniformed doormen. The sort of establishment that caters to wealthy travelers and business executives who expect a certain level of discretion and polish from everyone on staff. The kind of place where a scandal like a suspicious death would be the last thing management ever wanted associated with its name. The rooms went for prices that most ordinary people would balk at for even a single night. And the clientele tended to reflect that: well-dressed guests arriving with expensive luggage, staff trained to anticipate needs before they were even voiced. That particular hush of quiet competence you only really find in places built entirely around making wealthy people feel comfortable and unbothered. He worked night shifts fairly regularly, which meant dealing with whatever unusual situations tended to come up after most of the hotel's daytime staff had gone home. The quieter, stranger hours when a much smaller crew was left responsible for handling anything that happened. Everything from noise complaints to the occasional medical emergency. All of it handled with the same practiced discretion the hotel applied to everything else. During one of those night shifts, the security desk received a frantic phone call, the kind of call that immediately puts everyone on edge the moment the phone starts ringing at that particular hour. A man was on the line, clearly panicked, his voice shaking and rushed, saying that his wife was in the bathtub and wasn't breathing. My brother and another security guard immediately rushed upstairs to the room the call had come from, moving as quickly as they could through the hotel's hallways, weaving past the occasional startled late-night guests still up, wandering the corridors, trying to piece together in those brief minutes exactly what they might be walking into, hoping against hope that it might turn out to be something less serious than it sounded. Sure enough, when they got up there and into the room, they found a woman lying in the tub, completely unresponsive, the bathwater long since gone cold around her body already showing signs that something had gone terribly wrong well before anyone had thought to check on her. My brother and the other guard worked together to get her out of the water, moving as fast as they could, and immediately began attempting CPR right there on the bathroom floor, doing everything they'd been trained to do in that kind of emergency, working urgently in the hope that there was still some chance of reviving her, counting compressions and checking for any flicker of response between rounds. While they were in the middle of those resuscitation attempts, the NIPT arrived on the scene, responding to whatever call had been placed alongside the initial emergency request, several officers making their way up to the room and taking in the scene with the kind of practiced, assessing calm you'd expect from people who'd walked into far worse before. Once the officers assessed the situation themselves, they told my brother and his coworker to stop performing CPR, explaining plainly that the woman was obviously dead, and that in their professional opinion, based on everything they were observing about her condition and the state of the room, she had likely been dead for a couple of hours already, well before that emergency call had even come in to the security desk in the first place. The husband was questioned extensively by law enforcement once the scene had been secured, taken aside into a separate area of the room, while officers and eventually a detective went through the details of the evening with him. According to what he told the police, he and his wife had gotten into some kind of argument earlier that evening, though the details of what exactly they'd fought about were never made entirely clear to anyone outside of that direct questioning. The specifics, kept fairly vague in whatever secondhand accounts, eventually made their way back to hotel staff. He said that after the argument, he had gone out on his own for a while, leaving the hotel and presumably wandering the city or visiting some bar or restaurant to cool off, the way people sometimes do after a fight with a spouse, needing some time and distance before facing each other again. When he came back to the room later that night, he claimed his wife was already in the bath. According to his account, he simply went to bed at that point without checking on her further, assuming she was fine and would join him once she'd finished. It was only some time later, when she still hadn't come to bed after what he apparently felt was an unusually long stretch of time, that he became concerned enough to go check on her, which was when he discovered her unresponsive in the tub and placed the emergency call to hotel security. Privately, among everyone who had been present that night, from my brother and his coworker to the responding officers themselves, the general consensus that quietly formed was that the husband likely had something to do with his wife's death in one way or another. There was something about the timeline he'd given, something about the specific details of his story that didn't sit entirely right with the people who had actually been there working the scene, who had seen the state of things firsthand rather than simply hearing about it secondhand. Small inconsistencies that nobody could quite articulate as concrete evidence, but that added up to a shared, unspoken sense that his account wasn't entirely truthful. But despite that shared suspicion, nothing about his account could actually be disproven or contradicted with any hard evidence, and so, at least as far as anyone in that immediate circle ever heard, the case never moved beyond that private, unofficial suspicion into anything more formal or conclusive. No charges filed. No further public developments that any of the hotel staff ever became aware of. A couple of weeks passed, and eventually, as hotels of that caliber generally do, the room was quietly returned to normal circulation and made available again for paying guests, cleaned and refreshed, and given no indication whatsoever of what had recently happened within its walls. Naturally, given the sensitivity and the potential reputational damage such an incident could cause for an establishment as upscale as that one, nothing about what had happened in that room was ever mentioned to anyone booking a stay there afterward, the whole event handled with the kind of discreet, practiced silence you'd expect from a business so dependent on maintaining its image among wealthy, repeat clientele who would almost certainly take their business elsewhere if word ever got around that a guest had died under suspicious circumstances in one of the rooms. Not long after the room went back into normal use, a woman who was a fairly frequent guest at the hotel, someone who apparently stayed there often enough to be recognized by at least some of the staff, made a reservation for an entire week's stay, likely there for business, given how often she seemed to pass through the city, according to what staff remembered of her. Through whatever combination of scheduling and room assignment logic the hotel used, she ended up being placed into that exact same room, the very first guest to actually stay there since the incident had occurred weeks earlier. A coincidence nobody working the front desk had any particular reason to think twice about at the time. The very next morning, first thing, she appeared at the front desk. She looked visibly upset, pale and shaken in a way the front desk staff apparently noticed immediately, and she had all of her luggage already packed and with her, clearly ready to leave the property entirely rather than simply asking to switch to a different room within the same hotel. She told the staff at the desk that she was canceling the remainder of her week-long reservation immediately, and that she would never, under any circumstances, be staying at that hotel again, no matter how much she had previously enjoyed her stays there in the past. Her voice apparently firm and completely resolute, despite how rattled she otherwise seemed. She explained that she hadn't slept even a single hour throughout the entire night, and that as far as she was concerned, The room itself was haunted, repeating the word more than once, as if daring anyone at the desk to challenge her on it. She described it with real conviction. Not the kind of vague unease someone might report after simply having a restless night in an unfamiliar bed, but something more specific and more disturbing than that. Something that had convinced her completely that whatever she'd experienced in that room overnight was not something she was willing to risk encountering again for even one more evening, no matter how loyal a customer she'd been to that hotel over the years. What made the whole thing even stranger was the fact that absolutely nobody working at the hotel had said a single word to her about what had previously happened in that particular room. She had no way of knowing, going into her stay, that a woman had died in that exact bathroom only a couple of weeks earlier. No way of knowing about the circumstances surrounding that death, the suspicious husband, the police investigation, any of it. As far as she was concerned, she had simply booked a normal room at a hotel she'd stayed at plenty of times before, with absolutely nothing to prime her mind toward expecting anything unusual or frightening to happen during her stay. No whisper from staff. No online review or rumor she might have picked up beforehand. Nothing at all that could have planted the idea in her head ahead of time. For the rest of the time my brother worked at that hotel, which was a fairly substantial stretch of time afterward, every single guest who was ever assigned to stay in that specific room ended up calling down to the front desk or to security at some point during their stay, reporting some kind of strange occurrence, some unusual disturbance they couldn't explain. Whether it was a sound they couldn't place, a feeling of being watched, or something that felt wrong about the room in a way none of them could quite articulate clearly. Many of those guests specifically asked to be moved to a different room entirely, rather than simply tolerating whatever they'd experienced for the remainder of their stay. Unwilling to spend even one more night in that particular space once something had unsettled them. Some even willing to accept a downgrade to a lesser room just to get out of that one as quickly as possible. My brother told me that the staff eventually developed a kind of quiet, unspoken awareness about that room among themselves. Even though nobody officially acknowledged what everyone privately believed about it, the kind of shared, unspoken understanding that develops among coworkers who've all witnessed the same strange pattern repeat itself often enough that they stop bothering to argue about whether it's real. Housekeeping staff apparently didn't love being assigned to clean it, and more than one employee mentioned feeling an unusual heaviness or coldness in the room that had nothing to do with the actual temperature setting on the thermostat, a couple of them going so far as to ask their supervisors, quietly, if someone else could take that particular room on the cleaning rotation instead. None of this was ever documented anywhere official, of course, since acknowledging any of it in writing would have been a liability nightmare for a hotel of that reputation. But among the staff who actually worked there and dealt with the fallout every time a new guest checked into that room, the pattern became impossible to ignore entirely, even if nobody wanted to say so out loud where a manager or a corporate representative might overhear. My brother never worked a shift himself where he personally witnessed anything happen inside that room. No strange sounds, no cold spots, nothing he could describe firsthand from his own direct experience the way he could describe finding that woman in the tub or hearing the panicked phone call that first night. But he told me that hearing about it secondhand, over and over again, from so many different guests who had no way of knowing about each other's experiences, who had no way of coordinating their stories or influencing one another's expectations before checking in, made it very difficult for him to write the whole thing off as simple coincidence or overactive imagination on the part of a handful of overly suspicious travelers, especially given how varied the guests themselves tended to be. From seasoned business travelers to families on vacation, all of them arriving with completely different expectations and completely different reasons to be staying there. He said that what struck him most, thinking back on all of it years later, was the sheer consistency of the pattern. How it wasn't just one or two isolated guests reporting something unusual, but seemingly every single person who ever stayed in that room during his time working there. A pattern that held steady across strangers who had absolutely no connection to each other and no reason to influence each other's perceptions. Guests from completely different backgrounds and completely different countries sometimes, all arriving at essentially the same conclusion within a single night of staying there. Business travelers who'd stayed at that hotel dozens of times without incident in other rooms would suddenly find themselves calling down at 2 or 3 in the morning once they were placed in that particular room, describing feelings of being watched, sounds they couldn't account for, an overwhelming sense of wrongness that none of them could quite put into concrete. Specific terms beyond simply insisting they needed to be moved immediately, some of them apparently too shaken to even fully articulate what exactly had frightened them so badly. The hotel, as far as my brother knew, never officially acknowledged any pattern at all, never took the room permanently out of circulation, never brought in anyone to investigate or address whatever might have been going on there, no clergy called in, no attempt at any kind of blessing or cleansing that some other establishments might have quietly considered under similar circumstances. From a purely business standpoint, taking a room out of a limited, highly profitable inventory in one of the city's most upscale properties simply wasn't something management was willing to do based on nothing more than a string of unverifiable guest complaints, no matter how consistent that string of complaints happened to be, and no matter how uneasy it apparently made some of the staff who had to deal with the fallout directly. So the room stayed in rotation, guests kept getting assigned to it, and the same basic pattern kept repeating itself, guest after guest, for as long as my brother continued working there. There's something particularly unsettling thinking about it now. In imagining that frequent guest checking into that room with no idea at all of what had happened there only weeks earlier, going about her evening the same way she always did on her trips to the city, unpacking her bags, maybe ordering room service, settling in for what she expected to be an entirely ordinary week away from home. Whatever happened to her overnight was apparently severe enough to override years of loyalty to that particular hotel in a single sleepless night. Severe enough that she was willing to walk away from a week's worth of prepaid reservation and however many loyalty points or benefits she might have built up over her many previous stays there. None of it mattering anymore, next to whatever she'd experienced between checking in and walking back down to that front desk the next morning. I've often wondered, hearing this story over the years, what exactly it was that guests were sensing in that room, whether it had anything to do with the actual circumstances of that woman's death, some lingering trace of whatever had truly happened between her and her husband that night, or whether it was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with that particular incident at all, and had simply always been present in that space long before any of it occurred, waiting there undisturbed until enough attention or awareness somehow drew it out. My brother has told me this story more than a handful of times over the years, at family gatherings, on long car rides, whenever the topic of strange or unexplainable experiences comes up among family or friends. And it's remained one of the stories he tells with the most conviction, the details never shifting or softening the way some old stories do after being retold so many times. He's not someone prone to exaggeration or dramatics in general, which has always made this particular story carry more weight with me than it might otherwise, coming from someone who spent years working security in a business built entirely around discretion. Someone trained to notice and report on unusual behavior as a matter of professional habit rather than personal curiosity. My brother has never claimed to know the answer to that himself. All he's ever been able to say with any real certainty is what he personally witnessed that first night. Pulling a woman from a bathtub who, according to the police who arrived shortly afterward, had already been dead for hours. And everything that came afterward. Guest after guest, complaint after complaint. None of them ever knowing the history of the room they'd been assigned to. And all of them, without exception, wanting nothing more than to leave it behind as quickly as possible. My aunt told me this story a long time ago, back when I was a teenager, and she made me promise never to bring it up in front of my grandmother, since it involves my grandmother's own younger sister, a woman who died decades before I was ever born. Under circumstances the family rarely talks about openly even now. I am sharing it here because it has stayed with me for years. One of those stories that quietly reshapes how you think about your own family history once you hear it, especially the parts nobody ever wanted to fully explain. My grandmother grew up in a large farmhouse out in a rural part of the country, one of 6 children in a family that worked the land themselves. The kind of household where everyone had daily chores and responsibilities from a very young age, and where the days followed the same steady, predictable rhythm season after season. Mornings began before sunrise with feeding animals and hauling water, and evenings ended early too, since the whole family rose again with first light, regardless of how tired anyone felt the night before. It was a hard life in many ways, but a stable and ordinary one. The kind of upbringing shared by most families in that particular farming community, where neighbors knew each other well and looked out for one another, almost as if they were extended family themselves. Her younger sister, who I will call Ruth here, was 2 years behind her, close enough in age that the two of them shared nearly everything growing up. A bedroom, friends, the same small local school. The kind of closeness between sisters that often lasts an entire lifetime under normal circumstances. They walked to school together every morning along the same dirt road, split their evening chores so that whoever finished first would help the other, and told each other everything, or at least believed they did, in the easy, unguarded way young sisters often assume they always will. Ruth, according to everything my aunt has told me over the years, was a bright, curious child, well-liked by everyone in their small community, with nothing about her early life suggesting anything unusual or troubled. The family was reasonably well-regarded locally, hardworking and quietly religious in the understated way common to that particular region and generation, attending the same small church every Sunday along with most of their neighbors, living a life that, from the outside, looked entirely ordinary and unremarkable. The trouble, as my aunt always described it when telling this story, began gradually when Ruth was around 13 years old, starting with small changes that nobody in the family initially thought much of. She became increasingly withdrawn over the course of several months, spending long stretches of time alone in the small room she shared with my grandmother, showing less and less interest in activities and friendships she had previously enjoyed without any apparent hesitation. My grandmother, only a young teenager herself at the time, noticed the change in her younger sister, but like most people that age, did not have the perspective or vocabulary yet to fully understand what she was actually witnessing happening to someone she loved. Over time, according to what my aunt eventually pieced together from old family letters and the occasional careful, reluctant comment from relatives who had actually lived through that period themselves, Ruth began exhibiting behavior that increasingly alarmed everyone around her. She started talking, quietly and privately at first, about hearing a voice that no one else in the house could hear. A voice she described as belonging to someone she called her friend, though she could never fully explain who this friend actually was or where the voice was coming from whenever family members pressed her gently for more details. At first, given the era and the rural, somewhat isolated community they lived in, The family largely assumed this was simply an unusually vivid imaginary friend, the kind of thing children sometimes create for themselves, expecting Ruth to eventually grow out of it, the way most children naturally do as they get a bit older. But as the months went on, Ruth's behavior around this so-called friend grew increasingly concerning rather than simply childish or imaginative. She began having long, one-sided conversations late at night, audible to my grandmother lying awake in the bed beside her. Conversations where Ruth would speak quietly and then pause, as though genuinely listening to a response only she could hear. Her expression shifting through various emotions during these long, private exchanges that stretched sometimes for hours after the rest of the household had gone quiet for the night. My grandmother told my aunt, many years later, that what disturbed her most during this period was not necessarily the conversations themselves, strange as they were, but the specific way Ruth's voice would sometimes change during them, dropping suddenly into a tone that did not match her own natural voice at all, lower and stranger, before shifting back to something closer to normal moments later. My grandmother, lying frozen in the dark bed beside her sister on more than one of these nights, too frightened to fully understand what she was witnessing, and too young to know what, if anything, she should do about it, never told their parents directly about the specific details of what she was hearing during those long overnight conversations, partly out of fear, and partly, she admitted later in life, out of a strange, hard-to-explain instinct that speaking about it too directly might somehow make things worse. The family did eventually become alarmed enough, as Ruth's behavior continued shifting further from anything they recognized as normal for her, to seek help from their local church, consulting with their pastor about what was happening. Hoping for guidance on how to handle a situation none of them had any real framework for understanding at the time. In a community that small, word of a family's troubles rarely stayed private for long, and my aunt has said that some of the older relatives later admitted neighbors had begun quietly asking questions too. Noticing that Ruth no longer came to the schoolyard games she used to enjoy. Noticing the drawn, tired look that had settled over my grandmother's own face from too many disrupted nights of sleep beside her sister. The pastor visited the house on several occasions, speaking privately with Ruth, praying with the family, offering the kind of spiritual guidance and reassurance available within that particular community's understanding of the world. Though according to my aunt, none of it seemed to meaningfully change whatever was happening to Ruth during that period. My great-grandparents, for their part, grew increasingly desperate as the weeks passed, trying one remedy after another suggested by relatives and neighbors alike, moving Ruth's bed briefly into a different room, keeping a lamp burning through the night, having an older cousin sit up with her on the nights when my grandmother herself simply could not bear to do it again. None of these efforts seemed to make any lasting difference, and my aunt says the sense of helplessness that settled over the household during that stretch of time was something my grandmother carried with her, in some quiet form, for the rest of her life. Things came to a head one particular night that my aunt has always described with a kind of hushed, careful seriousness whenever she tells this story, clearly still affected by it herself, despite having only heard it secondhand from my grandmother many years after it actually happened. According to what my grandmother eventually shared, very late one night, well past when the rest of the household had gone to sleep, she woke to find Ruth sitting upright in their shared bed, not asleep, not restless the way a young girl having a bad dream might be, but sitting perfectly still, facing directly toward the closed bedroom door, her expression completely calm, in a way that felt entirely wrong given the hour and the darkness surrounding them. My grandmother, startled awake by this stillness beside her, asked Ruth quietly what she was doing, whether something was wrong. Ruth, without turning to look at her sister at all, continuing to stare directly at that closed bedroom door, said only that her friend was outside in the hallway, waiting, and that she needed to go see what he wanted. My grandmother, frightened by the flat, distant quality in her sister's voice, grabbed her arm and told her firmly to stay in bed, that there was nothing outside their door at that hour, that whatever she thought she was hearing was simply a dream. Ruth, according to my grandmother's account, turned to look at her then for the first time, and my grandmother always described her sister's expression in that specific moment as the single most frightening thing she witnessed during that entire period. An expression that held none of Ruth's usual warmth or familiarity, looking back at her instead with something that felt distant and strange in a way she struggled to fully put into words even decades later. Ruth told her, in that same flat, unfamiliar voice, that her friend did not like it when people tried to stop her from listening to him, and that my grandmother should be careful about that going forward. My grandmother, thoroughly frightened by this point, held onto her sister's arm and refused to let go, eventually managing to get Ruth to lie back down, though she said Ruth remained tense and rigid beside her for a long while afterward, occasionally whispering quiet. Unintelligible words that my grandmother did her best not to listen to too closely, terrified of what she might hear if she paid too much attention. The situation reportedly continued along similarly disturbing lines over the following weeks, with the family growing increasingly desperate, eventually deciding to send Ruth away for a period of time to stay with an aunt who lived in a larger town some distance away, hoping that a change of environment, away from whatever seemed to be affecting her at home, might help her recover and return to her normal self. According to what little my aunt has been able to piece together, Ruth did seem to improve somewhat during her time away, the strange late-night conversations becoming less frequent, her overall demeanor gradually returning closer to how she had been before everything started. She eventually returned home after several months away, seemingly much improved, and for a period of time afterward, life in the household appeared to return largely to normal, the frightening incidents of the previous months fading into something the family rarely discussed directly, treating it as a difficult period they had thankfully moved past. My grandmother, for her part, never fully returned to her previous closeness with her sister, always maintaining, according to my aunt, a certain quiet wariness around Ruth for the rest of both their lives, though she also never spoke in detail about exactly why, beyond vague references to that difficult period when Ruth was 13. Ruth herself lived a fairly ordinary life after that, by all outward appearances, eventually marrying, having children of her own, and living well into old age without any further incidents that the family ever spoke about openly. Whatever had happened during that specific stretch of her early teenage years remained something the family treated with careful, deliberate silence for the rest of their lives, mentioned only rarely and always in hushed, careful tones, the way families sometimes handle memories too uncomfortable to examine too directly, even many decades after the fact. There is one more detail my aunt has mentioned only a handful of times, always somewhat reluctantly, as though even after all these years, she is still not entirely sure it belongs in the story at all. Many years later, long after Ruth had grown up, married, and moved into a home of her own several towns away, my grandmother apparently visited her there once during a family gathering, the two of them elderly by that point, their children and grandchildren filling the house around them. At some point during that visit, alone together briefly in the kitchen, my grandmother worked up the courage to ask Ruth, gently and carefully, whether she remembered anything at all from that winter so long ago, whether she remembered her friend. According to what my aunt was told, Ruth's expression changed for just a moment, something brief and unreadable passing across her face before she simply said that she did not remember much from that time at all, and changed the subject to something else entirely. the conversation moving on as easily as if nothing significant had been asked. My grandmother never brought it up again after that, and the two sisters continued their relationship exactly as it had been before, warm enough on the surface, but never quite closing that small, permanent distance that had opened between them so many decades earlier. My aunt only learned the fuller details of this story herself many years later, piecing it together gradually from occasional comments my grandmother let slip during her own final years, along with a handful of old letters exchanged between family members during that specific period. Letters that referenced Ruth's troubles only vaguely and carefully, in the coded, indirect language people of that era often used when discussing anything they considered too shameful or frightening to name directly. What has always stayed with me most, hearing this story from my aunt, is not any single dramatic moment within it, but rather the quiet, lasting distance it apparently created between my grandmother and her sister for the rest of their lives. Two sisters who had shared everything as children, growing into adults who remained polite and outwardly close, but who never fully recovered whatever closeness had existed between them before that particular period. My grandmother apparently never fully able to forget the specific way her sister's voice and expression had changed during those late-night conversations with whatever, or whoever, she had called her friend. My aunt has always been careful to say that she does not know, and will probably never know for certain, exactly what actually happened to Ruth during that stretch of her early teenage years. Whether it was some kind of genuine, unexplainable presence, an early and serious mental health crisis that the family, limited by the understanding and resources available to them at that specific time and place, simply had no proper framework or language for addressing directly, or some combination of both that defies any single clean explanation. What she does know, from the careful, hushed way my grandmother spoke about it during her own final years, is that whatever happened left a lasting mark on her, a quiet unease around her own sister that never fully faded, even across the many decades of otherwise ordinary family life that followed. I think about this story sometimes, particularly the image of my grandmother as a young girl, lying frozen in the dark beside her own sister, listening to a voice in a conversation she could not fully understand or explain, too frightened to call out for help, too young to know what exactly she was witnessing. It makes me think about how much of our own family histories likely contain stories like this one, carefully buried and rarely spoken about directly, quietly shaping the people who lived through them in ways that ripple outward, sometimes for generations, long after everyone directly involved has passed away, and the full details have faded into exactly the kind of careful, half-remembered family story I am telling you now. I have wondered, too, what it must have been like for Ruth herself, living out the rest of her long life carrying whatever memory she kept of that period, if she remembered any of it clearly at all. My aunt has said that in her old age, Ruth was known among her own grandchildren as a warm, gentle woman, quick to laugh, endlessly patient with small children. Nothing at all like the distant, unsettling figure my grandmother described from that one particular winter. Whether Ruth simply never remembered the specifics of what had happened to her as a girl, or whether she remembered perfectly well and chose, for her own reasons, never to speak of it for the rest of her life, is something none of us will likely ever know for certain. What has always struck me most, turning this story over in my mind across the years since my aunt first told it to me, is how ordinary everything around it was. This was not a story about a haunted house standing empty and abandoned, or a cursed object passed down through generations, or some isolated, dramatic single night of terror that ended as suddenly as it began. It was a story about a perfectly normal family in a perfectly normal farmhouse, living perfectly normal days, who found themselves slowly, quietly overtaken by something none of them had the language or the tools to fully name or confront. Something that arrived gradually enough that by the time it was undeniably real, it had already reshaped the entire household around it. My aunt always ends the story the same way, saying that she does not tell it to frighten anyone, and that she has never fully decided herself what she believes actually happened to Ruth during those months. But she also always adds, in the same quiet, careful tone she uses for the rest of the story, that she has never once doubted my grandmother's account of what she personally witnessed lying in that shared bed night after night, listening to her younger sister speak in a voice that did not sound like her own, to someone or something that only Ruth herself could ever claim to see. This happened during spring break of 2010, a trip a group of my closest friends and I had been planning for weeks beforehand. The kind of simple, low-budget camping trip college-aged guys in South Arkansas tend to take when the weather starts warming up, and everyone wants an excuse to spend a few days away from responsibilities, out on the water, away from any kind of real schedule. There were 5 of us total that year, all friends since high school. The kind of group that had been taking some version of this same spring trip for a few years running by that point, usually to the same lake, since it was close enough to home that we did not need to burn an entire day just getting there and back, and familiar enough that we already knew the best spots for fishing, the best coves for swimming, and which little islands made for the easiest camping. We decided that year to camp out on a small island in the middle of a local lake, a spot several of us had visited before on smaller day trips, but never for a full multi-night stay. We packed up tents, coolers full of food and beer, fishing gear, and everything else we figured we would need, loaded it all into a couple of boats, and made our way out to the island early on the first afternoon of the trip, the kind of easy, low-stress start to a vacation that made all 5 of us feel like we had made the right call, choosing to spend our break this way instead of doing whatever more typical spring break trip our other classmates were off doing somewhere else. Setting up camp took a good part of that first afternoon. Getting tents pitched, a fire pit properly built and cleared, coolers positioned in the shade so the ice would last a little longer. All the usual small tasks that come with getting a campsite ready for a few days of use. We picked a spot on the island with a clear view of the water in both directions, close enough to the shoreline that we could keep an eye on our boats, but far enough back that the fire would not be visible from every angle around the lake. By the time evening rolled around on that first night, we had a solid little setup going, a fire crackling, food cooking on a small portable grill someone had brought along, and a good number of beers already being passed around as we settled into the relaxed, easy mood that Trip had promised from the start. It was sometime during that first evening, with the sun starting to go down and the lake beginning to take on that quiet, golden look it gets right before full darkness sets in, that we noticed a canoe slowly making its way past our little stretch of shoreline, close enough that whoever was paddling it could clearly see our campsite and the fire we had going. There was just one person in the canoe, a guy who looked to be around our own age, paddling at an easy, unhurried pace, seemingly in no particular rush to get anywhere in particular. As he got close enough, he called out to us, asking how we were doing, friendly and casual, in that easy way people often are out on the water in that part of the country, where running into other people enjoying the same lake usually leads to a quick, pleasant exchange rather than any real hesitation or wariness. Being from South Arkansas ourselves, and generally assuming, as most people from that area tend to, that pretty much everyone out enjoying the same lake is friendly and probably up for a bit of company, a few of us called back and invited him to paddle over and join us for a while, offering him some of the grilled meat and beer we had going, figuring one more friendly face around the fire could only make the evening better. He accepted, without much hesitation, paddling his canoe over and pulling it up onto the small stretch of sandy shore near our campsite, joining our little group around the fire not long after. He introduced himself as Kurt, and from the very start, he came across as a genuinely likable, easygoing guy. Quick to laugh, easy to talk to, the kind of person who fits naturally into a group of strangers within just a few minutes of meeting them. We handed him a beer, offered him a plate of whatever we had going on the grill at that point, and he settled in with us around the fire like he had been part of the group the whole trip. Despite how friendly and easy he was to talk to, though, several of us noticed fairly early on that there was something underneath his friendliness that felt a little off. A kind of quiet sadness sitting just beneath the surface of his easy laughter and casual conversation. The sort of thing you sometimes pick up on with someone, even when they are actively trying to seem upbeat and relaxed. At some point during the evening, one of my friends asked him directly if everything was okay, noticing that same undercurrent the rest of us had also picked up on without quite being able to name it out loud. Kurt's answer to that question is something that has stuck with me clearly ever since, word for word, in a way most casual conversations from a random camping trip certainly do not. He said, in a tone that still sounded fairly light on the surface, that it was nothing really, just that his friends were probably worried about him at that point. Then he looked directly at me, specifically at me out of everyone sitting around that fire, and gave a slow, deliberate wink before adding, "They'll find out soon enough." At the time, sitting there with a beer in my hand and the fire crackling in front of us, I honestly did not think much of that particular comment beyond a brief, passing, thought that it was a slightly odd thing to say. It is only in hindsight, given everything that happened afterward, that those specific words and that specific look he gave me have stayed lodged in my memory so vividly, replaying themselves more times over the years than I would probably like to admit. As the evening wore on and it started getting properly dark, several of us pointed out to Kurt that he had been drinking a fair amount along with the rest of us, and that paddling a canoe alone across open water in the dark probably was not the safest plan. Offering instead to let him just stay the night with us at our campsite. Plenty of room around the fire and enough gear that we could easily set him up with a spot to sleep comfortably until morning. He declined the offer fairly firmly, saying he needed to get to wherever he was actually headed, seeming genuinely adamant about it in a way that felt slightly out of proportion to what should have been a fairly simple, low-stakes decision about where to spend one night. Curious about where exactly he was trying to get to at that hour, especially since he seemed so determined to leave, despite the offer to stay somewhere safe and dry. I asked him directly where he was headed, half thinking that maybe we could offer him a faster, safer ride somewhere, using one of the jet skis we had brought along on the trip, rather than letting him paddle off alone into the dark in just his canoe. Kurt did not answer the question directly, at all. Instead, he simply looked around at the group of us sitting there by the fire and said, "You boys don't know how lucky you are." A comment that, much like his earlier one about his friends finding out soon enough, struck several of us as strange in the moment, though none of us pushed him further on exactly what he meant by it. Shortly after that exchange, Kurt got back into his canoe, thanked us again for the food and the beer, and pushed off from the shore, paddling away from our campsite and disappearing into the darkness, settling over the lake, heading in a direction none of us had a clear view of once he moved beyond the reach of our campfire's light. We talked about him a little bit after he left, mostly agreeing that he seemed like a genuinely nice guy, if a little strange in some of the specific things he had said, before eventually moving on to other conversation as the night continued and more beers got passed around the fire. None of us thought much more about Kurt or that slightly odd exchange for the rest of that night. eventually turning in fairly late and sleeping soundly enough, considering we were camping out on an open island with nothing but tents and sleeping bags between us and the night air. We woke up early the next morning, as planned, intending to get a good stretch of fishing in before the day got too hot, gathering our gear and making our way down to the water's edge not long after sunrise. We had only been out fishing for a short while, still fairly early in the morning with the lake mostly quiet around us, when a police boat approached our position, slowing down and pulling up alongside where we were fishing. The officer aboard called out to us, asking whether we were part of the search party that had found the body. We looked at each other, completely confused, having absolutely no idea what he was talking about, having spent the previous day simply setting up camp, grilling food, and enjoying a casual night around the fire with, as far as we knew, nothing unusual happening beyond one slightly odd but perfectly pleasant conversation with a stranger who had paddled by in a canoe. Once it became clear we genuinely had no idea what he meant, the officer explained the situation to us directly. He told us that a young man had gone missing from that same lake roughly a week earlier, last seen heading out alone in a canoe and never returning, prompting an extended search effort involving local authorities and volunteers over the following days. He told us that divers had finally located the young man's body at the bottom of the lake just 2 days before this current morning, bringing the search to its tragic, but at least conclusive, end. He then told us the missing young man's name, a name that hit every single one of us standing there on that boat at almost exactly the same moment. Because it was the exact same name the friendly stranger who had shared our fire and our food the previous evening had introduced himself to us as the night before. The officer told us his name had been Kurt Clark, and as those words left his mouth, I felt an ice-cold wave move through my entire body, standing there on that small fishing boat in the early morning light, trying and failing to reconcile what I was hearing with the very clear, very specific memory of sitting around a fire the night before, sharing beers and grilled meat with a guy who had introduced himself using that exact same name, who had specifically said his friends were probably worried about him, who had looked directly at me and said they'll find out soon enough before paddling off alone into the darkness. None of us said much of anything to the officer beyond confirming that no, we had not been part of any search party and that we did not have any information to offer him about the situation he was describing, since telling him what we had actually experienced the night before felt in that immediate moment of shock, like something none of us were quite ready to say out loud yet, uncertain ourselves how to explain it, or whether anyone would even believe us if we tried. Once the officer's boat pulled away and continued on with whatever official business had brought him out to that part of the lake that morning, the 4 or 5 of us, left standing there on our own small boat, looked at each other for a long, silent moment, none of us needing to say anything out loud for everyone to understand that we had all just made the exact same terrible connection at the exact same time. We had spent a good portion of the previous evening sitting around a campfire with a young man who, according to what we had just been told by a police officer, had already been dead and resting at the bottom of that same lake for at least 2 full days before we ever supposedly met him paddling by in his canoe. We did not finish out the rest of our planned camping trip after that. By unspoken, unanimous agreement, we made our way back to the island, packed up our entire campsite as quickly as we possibly could, loading the boats in near total silence, none of us saying much of anything to each other beyond the practical logistics of getting our gear together, and left the lake that same day, none of us particularly eager to spend even one more night out on that water after. What we had just learned, none of us, as far as I know to this day, has ever been able to fully explain what actually happened around that fire the night before. Whether it was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by too much beer in an unfamiliar, isolated environment, some strange coincidence involving a person who simply happened to share the exact same name as the young man who had actually died, or something far stranger and harder to explain than either of those two more comfortable possibilities. I have thought about that night more times than I can count in all the years since it happened, replaying the specific details over and over. The easy, friendly conversation, the strange sadness underneath it, and especially those two specific comments Kurt made before paddling away from our fire for the final time. They'll find out soon enough. And you boys don't know how lucky you are. Whatever actually happened out on that lake during spring break of 2010, I have never been able to shake the memory of it. And to this day, more than a decade later, I have never once gone back to that particular lake. Even though I still live fairly close by, and plenty of my old friends from that trip continue to fish and camp there themselves without much apparent hesitation. I simply cannot bring myself to spend another night camped out on that water. Not after everything that happened, and not after that specific, unmistakable wink Kurt gave me right before telling me something I still, even now, have absolutely no good way of fully explaining. The five of us have talked about that night many times since, usually only when we happen to all be together again and someone eventually brings it up. Always with the same slightly uneasy laughter that people use to talk around something they still do not fully know how to process seriously. A couple of my friends have tried over the years to find some rational explanation that would let all of us stop thinking about it so much, suggesting maybe we simply misheard the officer or misremembered the exact name Kurt gave us that night after a full evening of drinking. Small details shifting slightly in memory the way they sometimes do. But every time we have gone back over it together, comparing our separate memories side by side, we have always landed on the same conclusion, that the name matched exactly, that the timeline matched exactly, and that none of us can offer any better explanation than the deeply unsettling one sitting right in front of us the whole time. One of my friends did eventually try looking into the local news coverage from that same week, curious enough, despite his own uneasiness, to see if he could find the original missing person report or any further details about the search that had apparently been going on the entire time we were setting up our campsite, just a short distance away. He found a short article confirming the basic outline of what the officer had told us. A young man reported missing after heading out alone in a canoe, an extended search involving local volunteers, and the eventual tragic recovery of his body from the lake. Seeing it confirmed there in an actual printed article, rather than just the officer's spoken words from that morning, somehow made the whole thing feel even more solid and undeniable than it already had, stripping away that last small, comforting possibility that maybe we had simply misunderstood something in the moment. None of us have ever come up with a satisfying way to talk about what actually sat across our campfire from us that night, sharing our food, drinking our beer, laughing along with our jokes, before paddling off alone into the dark toward wherever it was he said he needed to be. We do not really try to explain it to people outside our own small group anymore, since it tends to sound told out loud to someone who was not there, exactly like the kind of exaggerated campfire story it very much was not. But among ourselves, the five of us who were actually there that night, there has never been any real doubt about what we experienced, only a shared, quiet unease that has never fully faded, no matter how much time continues to pass since that particular spring break. There are things that happened to me before I was old enough to form real memories, or at least that's what I always believed, until the day I learned that some memories don't follow the normal rules. I was only 2 years old when my uncle killed my grandparents and then turned the gun on himself, and for most of my life I had no idea any of it had happened, let alone that I had witnessed it firsthand. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story I heard secondhand from relatives whispering at holidays. It's something I lived through, something buried so deep in my mind that it took over a decade to resurface. And when it finally did, it came back whole, vivid, and undeniable. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to understand how a mind that young could hold on to something so complete. Doctors and therapists I've spoken to over the years have offered different explanations. Some saying that trauma of that magnitude can imprint itself differently than ordinary memory, bypassing the usual process of forgetting that erases most of what happens to us before a certain age. Others have been more skeptical, suggesting that maybe I absorbed fragments over the years without realizing it. Small comments overheard, a photograph glimpsed at the wrong moment, and my mind assembled them into something that only felt like a memory. I understand why people reach for that explanation. It's easier, in some ways, to believe that than to accept that a 2-year-old could carry something like this fully intact for over a decade. But I know what I remember, and I know how it felt when it resurfaced, not like piecing together clues, but like a door swinging open on a room that had been locked the entire time. My uncle had been struggling with drug addiction for a long time before that day. Meth had gotten its hooks into him slowly, the way it tends to with people, until the person my family remembered from years earlier had been almost completely replaced by someone unpredictable and desperate. For a while, my grandmother had been supporting him financially, giving him money whenever he asked, telling herself each time that it would help him get back on his feet, that this next bit of help would be the one that finally made a difference. It never was. He kept coming back, kept needing more, and eventually, my grandmother reached the point where she couldn't keep enabling him anymore. From what I've been told since, by aunts and uncles who were around during those years, my uncle had once been the kind of person people genuinely liked being around. He had a sense of humor, apparently, the kind that could lighten a tense room. And he'd been close with my grandmother in a way that some of her other children weren't. That closeness is probably part of why she kept giving him money long after most people would have stopped. Why she kept believing that somewhere underneath the addiction, the son she remembered was still reachable. It's a particular kind of tragedy, loving someone enough to keep hoping for them, even as the evidence mounts that the person you're hoping for might already be gone. On the day it happened, she finally told him no. I don't know the exact words that were exchanged between them, whether it was a calm refusal or a heated argument, because I was far too young at the time to understand adult conversation in any real way. What I do know, because I lived through what came next, is that something in him broke completely the moment she said it. I happened to be at my grandparents' house that day, dropped off the way grandchildren often are, for an afternoon of nothing more dramatic than snacks and naps and maybe some time in the backyard. There was no reason for anyone to think that day would be any different from any other visit. But when my grandmother refused to give my uncle more money, he didn't argue further. He walked away in silence toward his old bedroom and came back holding a shotgun. What happened next unfolded with a speed that still seems impossible to me whenever I think back on it, even though I lived through every second of it. He raised the shotgun toward my grandfather and shot him directly in the face. There was no warning beyond that silence, no chance for my grandfather to react or defend himself. One moment, he was simply present in that room, and the next, he was gone. My grandmother's instincts took over the moment the first shot rang out. She ran toward me, scooping me into her arms, holding me tight against her body in what must have been a desperate attempt to shield me from whatever was happening. It didn't save her. My uncle shot her in the back while she held me. I remember the sensation of her arms losing their strength, the sudden absence of the safety I had felt just moments before. She dropped me as she fell, and I hit the floor, though at that age the fall itself likely registered only as confusion rather than pain. She managed to roll over, whether from the impact of the shot or some final instinct to place herself between me and my uncle, I can't say for certain. What I do know is that it wasn't enough to stop what came next. My uncle didn't stop with the shotgun. He pulled out a large knife and struck my grandmother in the neck with it, right there on the floor in front of me. I have no way to soften that image, no gentler version of it to offer. It happened exactly as I remember it, in full view of a 2-year-old who had no understanding of death, but who understood, on some primal level, that everything safe about that afternoon had shattered. Then he turned toward me. This is the part of the memory that has stayed with me most clearly, sharper and more detailed than anything a person my age should reasonably be able to recall. I was crying, overwhelmed by everything happening around me, too young to process it, but old enough to feel the fear pressing in from every direction. My uncle walked over and picked me up off the floor. For a moment, something strange happened. He held me against him and rocked me gently, the way you'd comfort a crying child, the way perhaps he had done countless times before in some earlier, better version of himself before addiction consumed everything good about him. That rocking lasted, in my memory, close to a full minute, though I have no real way of confirming the exact length of time. It was as if some small piece of the man he used to be surfaced briefly in the middle of all that devastation. Some last flicker of tenderness, struggling to exist alongside the horror he had just committed. Then he set me down in my baby swing, the small mechanical kind that rocks on its own, probably placed in that room specifically so I'd have somewhere safe and contained to sit while the adults went about their day. He stepped back from me, and he raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at my face. I remember the barrel of that gun with a clarity that still unsettles me today. It felt enormous in that moment, close enough to fill my entire field of vision, though I know now it likely wasn't as close as memory has made it seem. I don't know if a 2-year-old can truly comprehend the concept of dying, but I know that I understood, in some deep and wordless way, that something terrible was about to happen to me. And then, according to everything I remember, and everything that's since been confirmed to me, he simply stopped. He didn't lower the weapon right away. He stood frozen, the barrel still aimed at me, but something had shifted in him physically. It looked, in my memory, like he was struggling against something, like an invisible force had wrapped itself around his arms and was fighting to keep that trigger from being pulled. His whole body seemed to be locked in some kind of internal battle, straining against itself, as if some outside will had entered that room and taken hold of him at the exact moment he needed to be stopped. That struggle didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough. Instead of turning the gun on me, he brought the barrel to his own mouth. I don't remember the sound of the final shot with the same clarity as everything leading up to it. Maybe my mind protected me from that particular detail, the way memory sometimes shields us from the very worst parts of trauma, blurring just enough to make survival possible. But I know what happened. He pulled the trigger, and in an instant, the violence that had consumed that room for the past several minutes came to its final, irreversible end. That's where my memory of that day stops completely. I don't remember who discovered the scene, don't remember being carried out of the house, don't remember police or paramedics, or any of the chaos that surely followed. My mind drew a curtain over everything after that moment, leaving me only with the unbearable sequence that led up to it. And then, nothing at all. That's where my memory of that day stops. I don't remember who found us afterward, don't remember the sound of sirens or strangers rushing into that room, don't remember being lifted up and carried away from what remained. My mind simply cut off at that point, sparing me from whatever came next, and I've never tried to force my way past that boundary. Some part of me suspects that whatever protected me in those final moments with the shotgun also had a hand in protecting me from having to witness everything that followed: the arrival of police, the confusion, the grief of relatives learning what had happened. I'm grateful for that mercy, even if I'll never fully understand its shape. For most of my childhood, I had no conscious awareness that any of this had happened. My parents made the decision early on to never speak of it in front of me, hoping, I imagine, that if the words were never said in my presence, the memory itself might stay buried forever. That I could grow up without ever having to carry the weight of what I had witnessed. For a long time, it seemed to work exactly as they hoped. I grew up like any other kid, with no outward sign that something so dark sat quietly underneath the surface of my earliest years. Then, when I turned 13, everything came rushing back. I can't point to any single trigger that caused it, no specific sound or smell or event that unlocked it all at once. It simply resurfaced, fully formed and undeniable, exactly as I've described it here. The shotgun blast to my grandfather, my grandmother running to shield me and being shot in the back, the knife being picked up and rocked gently before being placed in the swing, the barrel pointed at my face, that strange, unexplainable resistance that seemed to fight against my uncle's own body, and finally, the gun turning on himself instead of me. It messed with my head badly for a long time after that. 13 is already a difficult age, full of its own confusion, without the added burden of suddenly remembering a triple tragedy you witnessed as a toddler. I didn't know who to tell or how to even begin explaining something so enormous. For years, I kept it entirely to myself, sometimes doubting my own mind, wondering whether it was even possible for a 2-year-old to retain memories this vivid, or whether somehow I had built these images later from fragments I might have overheard without realizing it. But the memory never felt constructed. It felt real in a way that's hard to put into words unless you've experienced something similar yourself. The kind of memory that carries its own weight and certainty, regardless of how old you were when it happened. It wasn't until about a year ago that I finally found the courage to tell my dad everything I remembered. I sat him down and walked him through it as carefully as I could. The shotgun, my grandmother running toward me, the knife being picked up and rocked, the swing, the gun pointed at my face, that strange resistance, and finally, my uncle turning the weapon on himself. My dad started crying almost the moment I began describing it. He and my mother had always assumed I was far too young to have retained any memory of that day, and hearing me recounted in such detail clearly shattered that assumption completely. As I spoke, he confirmed piece after piece, details that matched exactly what had actually happened in that room. Details I had no way of knowing unless I had truly lived through them myself. Then he told me something that gave the whole memory an even heavier weight than I had already been carrying. He said that once everything had been pieced together afterward, by family members and investigators alike, they learned that I had been found sitting calmly in my swing, rocking gently back and forth, completely unharmed. He told me it looked, from everything anyone could reconstruct, as though someone had been pushing that swing to keep me calm, even though there was no one left alive in that room capable of doing it by the time it would have mattered. Hearing him confirm that detail, something I hadn't even fully registered as significant in my own memory until he said it out loud, sent a chill through me that I don't think will ever fully go away. I sat there across from him at the table, watching his hands shake slightly as he spoke, realizing that he had carried this secret for years, too, quietly hoping I would never have to know, quietly wondering, I imagine, whether he had made the right choice in staying silent for so long. I think about that moment constantly, about whatever force seemed to resist my uncle in those final seconds before he turned the gun on himself, about the possibility that something, or someone, was present in that room with me, holding back the worst of it, keeping that swing moving long after any living hand should have been able to. I don't have a name for whatever protected me that day. I don't know if it was some fragment of humanity still clinging to my uncle underneath everything the drugs had taken from him, or something else entirely, something beyond anything I have language for. All I know is that I was 2 years old, surrounded by the aftermath of something unimaginable, and somehow I walked away from that room completely untouched. Over the years, I've talked to a few people about what happened, carefully, choosing who I trust with it, because I've learned that not everyone knows how to receive something like this. Some people want to explain it away immediately, offering theories about trace memory or trauma-related false recollection, trying to make it fit neatly into something they already understand. Others go the opposite direction, treating it like proof of something otherworldly, wanting to talk about angels or spirits or fate in ways that feel too tidy for what actually happened. The truth is, I don't need either explanation to feel complete. I don't need to know exactly what stopped my uncle's hand that day. I only know that something did, and that I am here because of it, however that came to be. I think about my grandparents often, too, not just the horror of how they died, but who they were before that day. The version of them that existed for my parents and my aunts and uncles long before I was born, the version I never got the chance to know, outside of family stories and old photographs. I think about how unfair it is that the last images connected to their lives are so violent, when surely they deserve to be remembered for so much more than the way they died. I try, when I think of them, to hold on to the stories my family has shared instead, the small details that make them feel like real people, rather than just victims in a tragedy I happen to survive. I carry this with me now, not as something I try to hide or forget, but as something I've had to slowly learn to live alongside. It shaped parts of who I am. Even during all those years, I had no conscious knowledge it was there. There are still moments when it catches up with me unexpectedly. A loud sound that makes me flinch harder than it should. A certain smell that unsettles me without explanation. A wariness around firearms that I've never quite been able to shake, even though I couldn't always explain where it came from. Now, at least, I understand why those reactions exist, even if understanding them hasn't made them disappear entirely. And even now, on quiet nights when my mind drifts back to that room, I find myself thinking about that swing, moving steadily back and forth, and wondering who or what was really holding on to me in those final, terrible moments, keeping me safe when everyone else in that room was already gone. I don't think I'll ever have a complete answer to that question, but I've stopped needing one. Some things, I've come to accept, are simply true without being explainable. And the fact that I'm still here, that I grew up, that I eventually found the words to tell my father what I remembered, and to finally tell this story to someone else, feels like enough of an answer on its own. My younger brother had an imaginary friend when he was little, which on its own wouldn't be worth mentioning, since plenty of kids go through a phase like that. Almost every family has some story about a child who insisted on setting an extra place at the table, or who refused to close a closet door because their invisible companion needed somewhere to sleep. Most of the time, these stories are harmless and even a little sweet, the kind of thing parents laugh about years later at family dinners, bringing up how their child used to insist on buckling an empty seat in the car, or leaving a spot open on the couch during movie nights. What made my brother's imaginary friend different, what still makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it, wasn't just the friend itself, but everything that came along with him. My brother was also a heavy sleepwalker from a very young age. The kind of sleepwalker who would wander through the house at strange hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just standing silently in doorways, and my parents had grown so used to it that they'd developed a whole system of safety measures. Gates at the top of the stairs, extra locks on doors, all the usual precautions families take when they have a child who can't be trusted to stay in bed through the night. I mention this because I think it matters to the story, because whatever happened with his imaginary friend seemed tangled up with that sleepwalking in ways none of us fully understood at the time. And honestly, still don't. He was around 3 or 4 years old when he started talking about someone named Freya. I remember the name distinctly because of how he pronounced it. A soft sound, Fry, said with the kind of casual familiarity you'd expect from a kid talking about a favorite cousin or a friend from daycare, not the tone you'd expect from someone describing a stranger. When we asked him who Freya was, expecting some vague, half-formed description the way kids usually give for imaginary friends, he gave us something far more specific than any of us anticipated. He described Freya as a man with dark skin who wore very little clothing and who loved to hunt out in the wilderness. It wasn't the kind of description that sounded like it came from a cartoon or a picture book. It sounded oddly specific, oddly grounded, the kind of detail you wouldn't expect a preschooler to invent out of nowhere. Then, one day, completely out of the blue, my brother told us something even stranger. He said that Freya used to live near our house a long time ago, not in some fantasy land, not somewhere far away in his imagination, but right there, near the actual house we lived in. And then he told us that white people had come and burned Freya alive, and that they had destroyed his entire village along with him. I remember the room going quiet after he said that. My parents exchanged a look, the kind of look adults give each other when they're trying to figure out whether to laugh it off or worry about it. It's not exactly the sort of thing you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. This specific, this dark, delivered with the same simple, matter-of-fact tone he might have used to tell us what he'd eaten for breakfast. None of us had any idea where he could have picked up something like that. We hadn't been teaching him about history. Certainly not anything that detailed or that dark, and even if we had, it wasn't the kind of thing that would have naturally translated into a description of an imaginary friend's tragic backstory. I've thought a lot, in the years since, about where a small child could possibly get an idea like that. We weren't the kind of family that watched historical documentaries around young kids, and nothing in his daily life, no books, no shows, nothing I could ever point to, contained anything close to what he described. I've asked my parents more than once whether they ever figured out where it might have come from, and they always give the same answer, which is that they never did, and that the not knowing bothered them more than they liked to admit at the time. My mother did some digging on her own, quietly, without telling us kids at the time. She looked into the history of the land our house sat on, curious whether there was any truth buried somewhere in old county records or local historical societies that might explain what my brother kept describing. She never found anything conclusive, nothing officially documented that matched what he'd said, but she told me years later that a few older residents in the area, people who'd lived there their whole lives, mentioned vague stories passed down through generations about something having happened on that land a long, long time before any of the current houses were built. Nothing specific enough to confirm anything, just enough to make her stop asking questions, she said, because she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Over the following months, the presence of Freya became something of a constant in our house. In the quiet, unsettling way that these things sometimes do. I would be in my room, door partly open, and I'd hear my brother in his room nearby. Talking, not the kind of talking kids do when they're just narrating their own play, moving action figures around and providing voices for both sides of an imaginary conversation. This was different. It had the rhythm of an actual back-and-forth conversation, pauses in exactly the right places, like he was genuinely listening to responses and reacting to them. Every time I got curious enough to check on him, to peek around the corner of his doorway and see what he was doing, the same thing happened. The moment I appeared, he would go completely silent, and he would turn his head, slowly, deliberately, toward the corner of the room, away from where I was standing. Not toward me, toward some empty space in the room that held nothing as far as I could see. It was such a small thing, really, just a kid going quiet and turning his head, but there was something about the consistency of it, the way it happened exactly the same way every single time. That unsettled me more than almost anything else that happened during that whole period. The situation with our middle brother is the part of this story that still bothers me the most, even now, years later. He'd gone to spend the summer with his dad, which wasn't unusual for our family. One of those custody arrangements that split up the year in predictable ways. He and my youngest brother had a complicated relationship. The kind of sibling dynamic where the older one sometimes teased or pushed the younger one around more than he probably should have. Nothing extreme. Just the ordinary friction that happens between brothers close in age, but noticeable enough that my mother had commented on it more than once. The day before our middle brother was set to come home from his summer visit, our youngest brother said something to my mother and me that neither of us has ever fully forgotten. He told us, in that same calm, matter-of-fact tone he always used when talking about Freya, that Freya didn't like when our middle brother was mean to him. And then, he added, almost as an afterthought, that Freya was going to scare him. We didn't think much of it in the moment, or at least we tried not to. It sounded like the kind of thing a kid might say when they're annoyed with a sibling. An idle threat, borrowed from whatever imaginary power their imaginary friend seemed to hold in their mind. Kids say strange things all the time, and most of the time those things mean absolutely nothing beyond the workings of an active imagination. My mother even laughed a little when he said it, telling him not to talk about scaring his brother, and he just shrugged and went back to whatever he'd been doing, completely unbothered, as though he'd simply been passing along a piece of information rather than making any kind of threat himself. The next evening, our middle brother came home. My mother and I were downstairs going about our usual evening routine when we heard a scream from upstairs that I can still hear clearly in my memory to this day. Sharp and full of real, immediate terror in a way that made both of us bolt up those stairs without even exchanging a word first. We found our middle brother sitting upright in his bed, absolutely certain, insisting through what was clearly genuine panic that someone had been violently shaking his bed. It was a bunk bed, an old wooden one that had been passed down through a couple of different configurations in our house over the years, sturdy enough that it wasn't the kind of thing that shook easily on its own. He kept repeating that someone had grabbed the frame and shaken it hard enough to jolt him awake, hard enough that he was convinced, in that first disoriented moment, that someone was actually in the room with him. Our youngest brother, the one who supposedly held some kind of influence over Freya, was sound asleep the entire time, not pretending to be asleep, not lying there with his eyes closed waiting to see what would happen. Genuinely, deeply asleep, the way small children often are, completely unaware of the scream that had just sent the rest of us running up the stairs. My mother checked on him first, gently shaking his shoulder, and he stirred slowly, groggy and confused, clearly pulled out of a real, deep sleep rather than caught pretending. About a month after that incident, our youngest brother took a bad fall and cracked his skull. He ended up being fine physically, thankfully, after a scary trip to the hospital and some anxious days of monitoring. But something changed after that fall. He never talked about Freya again. Not once. It was as if whatever connection he'd had to that presence simply ended the moment his head hit whatever he fell against. And no amount of gentle questioning from my parents ever brought Freya back into conversation again. But the sleepwalking didn't stop. If anything, it got worse in the months that followed. He would wander through the house at all hours, appearing in places you wouldn't expect a small child to have any interest in going, and more than once he showed up right beside my bed in the middle of the night. I would wake up to find him standing there, perfectly still, staring down at me with an expression that had absolutely nothing childlike about it. And I'm not ashamed to admit that more than once. The fear of that moment made me lose control of myself completely before I even had time to process what I was looking at. There's one particular night, though, that stands above all the others in my memory. The one that I still think about more than any of the rest of it combined. I was lying awake, unable to sleep, when I heard the distinct sound of our front door opening and then closing again. It was around 4 in the morning, deep enough into the night that the sound felt wrong in a way that pulled me immediately out of bed, my heart already racing before I'd even fully processed what I'd heard. I made my way downstairs and found the front door unlocked, slightly ajar, cold air seeping in from outside. I opened it fully and stepped out onto the porch, and that's when I saw him. My brother, standing at the very far end of our backyard, in the snow, wearing nothing but his underwear despite the freezing temperature. He was facing the house, facing me specifically, as if he'd known exactly where I would appear and exactly when. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood frozen on the porch, watching him standing perfectly still out there in the snow. His skin surely should have been reacting to the cold in some visible way, shivering, goosebumps, something. But from where I stood, he looked completely unaffected, completely calm, just standing there, staring back at me across the length of the yard. And then he raised his hand and waved, slowly, deliberately, the kind of wave that felt less like a small child acknowledging his sister and more like a greeting from something that understood exactly what it was doing. I called out his name and ran toward him across the frozen grass, my bare feet screaming against the cold, and by the time I reached him, he blinked, seemed to come back into himself, and looked around in the confused, disoriented way he always did whenever he woke from one of his sleepwalking episodes. He had no memory of leaving his bed, no memory of coming outside, no memory of standing in the snow or of waving at me from across the yard. When I asked him, gently, careful not to frighten him, whether he remembered anything at all, he just shook his head and asked why we were both standing outside in the cold. I never told him about the wave. I've never been sure exactly why I kept that detail to myself over the years, whether I was protecting him from something or protecting myself from having to explain it out loud again and again to people who would inevitably want a rational explanation I simply don't have. I remember standing there in the yard with him, wrapping my arms around him to try to get him warm and moving back toward the house, and thinking the whole way inside about how deliberate that wave had looked, how nothing about it had felt like the clumsy, half-conscious movement of a sleepwalking child. Once we were back inside, I sat with him on the couch for a while, wrapped in blankets, watching him slowly drift back into a more normal kind of sleep right there in the living room, rather than risk carrying him back upstairs. I remember staring at the front door the whole time, half expecting to hear it creak open again, half expecting to see some shape moving past the window. Nothing happened. The house stayed quiet for the rest of that night, but I didn't sleep again until the sun was fully up. Whatever Freya was, wherever that presence came from or whatever it wanted, it seemed to leave along with the memory of him after that fall, and eventually the sleepwalking calmed down too, fading gradually into something closer to normal childhood restlessness as my brother got older. We've never really talked about it as adults, not directly, not in any detailed way. It exists in our family now as one of those things everyone remembers happening, but nobody quite knows how to bring up in ordinary conversation, tucked away somewhere between memory and something we've all silently agreed not to examine too closely. Sometimes I wonder if my brother has any buried memory of that time at all, the way some experiences seem to hide themselves away only to resurface later in life. I've thought about asking him directly, sitting him down the way I imagine other people have done with siblings who lived through strange childhood events, but something always stops me. Maybe I'm afraid of what he might say. Maybe I'm afraid he'll remember more than any of us ever wanted him to. He's an adult now with no memory at all of Freya, no memory of the sleepwalking beyond the vague stories our family has told him over the years, stories he mostly laughs off as childhood weirdness rather than anything worth taking seriously. Sometimes I catch myself studying him at family gatherings, watching the easy, ordinary way he moves through the world now, and finding it almost impossible to reconcile that version of him with a quiet, watchful child who used to hold entire conversations with someone none of the rest of us could see. It makes me wonder how much of who we become as adults is shaped by things we can no longer remember, things that happened to us before our minds were even capable of holding on to them properly. But every once in a while, usually late at night when the house is quiet, in that particular way houses get quiet, I think about that backyard, about the snow, about my brother standing there in the freezing cold in nothing but his underwear, perfectly calm, perfectly still, and about that slow, deliberate wave that I've never been able to convince myself was just an ordinary act of a confused, sleepwalking child. And the shivers I feel when I think about it now have never had anything to do with the cold. My gran used to tell this story from when she was a young woman, sometime around the mid-1960s. And even though she'd tell it every so often over the years, it never lost its power to make the whole room go quiet whenever she started in on it. It wasn't the kind of tale she pulled out for every visitor or every holiday gathering. It tended to surface on quieter nights, usually when the conversation had already drifted toward old memories and family history, and someone would ask her, almost as a formality, whether anything strange had ever happened to her back in her younger days. She'd get a certain look on her face when that question came up, a mixture of hesitation and something almost like relief at being asked, and then she'd settle back into her chair and begin. Before I get into what happened, it helps to understand a little about where she lived. The city has always been known for its parks, more green space packed into it than you'd expect from somewhere so built up. And scattered throughout the older parts of town are these small fenced gardens sitting right in the middle of residential squares, the kind of quiet communal patches of green that the whole street shares rather than any one house owning them outright. The city itself carries a name that comes from old Gaelic words meaning something like Dear Green Place, which always struck me as fitting given how many of these little garden squares are tucked between the buildings even now. Small pockets of quiet nature hemmed in on all sides by tenement stone and cobbled streets. My gran worked at a theater in those days, the kind of job that kept her out late most nights, well past when most other people her age would have already been home and settled for the evening. After her shift ended, she'd catch the last bus of the night, the one that ran close to midnight, and from her stop, she had a short walk home. a walk that took her right past one of those fenced communal gardens before she reached her building. Back then, things were different in a lot of small ways that people today might find hard to picture. One of those differences was the relationship between ordinary people and the police who worked their local area. There was a particular constable who patrolled that part of town regularly, and over time, he and my gran had gotten to know each other well enough that he made a habit of meeting her off the last bus most nights, walking alongside her for that short stretch home, just to make sure she got there safely. It wasn't an official arrangement, nothing formal or assigned, just the kind of small, decent thing a community policeman did back when that sort of familiarity between neighbors and their local bobby was still common. He knew her by name, knew roughly what time her shift ended, depending on which show was running that week at the theater, and had apparently taken it upon himself, quietly, and without ever making a fuss about it, to make sure a young woman walking home alone, late at night, wasn't doing so completely unaccompanied. My gran spoke fondly of him whenever this part of the story came up, describing him as steady and unremarkable in the best possible way, the sort of man whose presence you barely registered as anything special until it wasn't there anymore. She said he'd talk about ordinary things during their walks, the weather, whatever had been happening at the theater that week, nothing memorable in itself, but comforting in its total predictability. It was, she always said, one of the small securities of that particular chapter of her life, something she leaned on without ever really thinking about it until the one night it wasn't there to lean on at all. On the particular night this story centers around, the theater had put on a longer show than usual, running a little past its normal finish time, which meant my gran was slightly later catching the last bus than she typically would have been. She always mentioned this detail when telling the story, as though it mattered somehow, as though that small delay had shifted everything else that followed into a slightly different, more dangerous alignment than an ordinary night would have produced. She was riding that last bus home as usual when a man sat down next to her, someone she didn't recognize as one of the regular late-night passengers she'd grown used to seeing. Almost immediately, something about him felt wrong to her. He struck up conversation in a way that felt too forward, asking her questions that were far too personal for a stranger on a night bus. The kind of questions that made her skin prickle with unease, even before she could fully articulate why. She'd been riding that bus regularly for long enough to have a good instinct for who belonged and who didn't, and everything about this man told her he didn't belong. Rather than sit there and continue enduring his questions, she got up from her seat and made her way toward the front of the bus, positioning herself near the driver instead. She knew the driver reasonably well from her regular late trips home, enough to strike up some friendly small talk with him, which she hoped would be enough to discourage the stranger from following her up there and continuing his questioning in front of someone else. It worked, at least for the rest of the ride. The man stayed in his seat, though she could feel him watching her from behind for the remainder of the journey. When the bus finally reached her stop, she stepped off, expecting to see her usual escort, the friendly local constable, waiting there the way he almost always was. But this time, there was no sign of him anywhere. The street was empty except for the bus idling at the curb and whatever passengers remained inside it. That absence alone was enough to unsettle her, since it had become such a reliable part of her nightly routine that its sudden disappearance felt like a small crack in the ordinary safety of the world. Things got worse almost immediately. Just as the bus was about to pull away, the sketchy man from earlier jumped up from his seat and hurried off the bus at the very last second, clearly having waited to see whether she'd have an escort waiting before deciding whether to follow her. He walked off in the opposite direction from her own path home, which should have been reassuring, except that he kept glancing back over his shoulder at her as he walked, again and again. in a way that made it very clear he was keeping track of exactly where she was and where she was headed. The bus pulled away from the curb, its engine noise fading into the distance, and my gran found herself standing alone on the street in the quiet aftermath of all that unease. The street lamps back then weren't nearly as bright or as plentiful as they are now, and she said the stretch of road she was standing on had a particular gap in the lighting right where the bus had left her, a stretch of near darkness between one lamp and the next that she'd never really noticed before that night. Not with her usual escort there beside her, to fill the silence and the shadow both. And that's when she noticed the dog. It was sitting in the middle of the road, a huge black dog, easily one of the largest she'd ever seen wandering loose on a street at that hour. There was no owner in sight, no lead, nothing to suggest it belonged to anyone nearby or had any business being out on its own in the middle of the night. Already rattled from everything that had just happened on the bus, she decided the smartest thing to do was simply get home as quickly as possible. So she set off at a brisk pace, eager to put some distance between herself and everything unsettling about that night. The dog began following her, not right at her heels, but keeping a steady distance of about 20 feet behind, matching her pace almost exactly whenever she sped up or slowed down. Every time she glanced back to check on it, there it was, the same distance away, watching her with an intensity that felt entirely too deliberate for an ordinary stray, simply wandering the same direction by coincidence. She turned the corner that brought her onto the final stretch of her walk home, the section of the route that took her directly past the fenced communal garden. As she got closer to the garden's open gate, the dog suddenly broke into a sprint straight toward her. Her heart must have leapt into her throat in that instant, certain that whatever calm distance the animal had been keeping was about to end violently. But the dog stopped abruptly, just about 2 feet away from her, and instead of attacking, it began growling and barking with real ferocity, hackles raised along its back, its whole body rigid and focused, not on her at all, but on the open gate of the garden behind her. It was, by her own account, absolutely losing its composure in the direction of that garden, snarling and barking at something she couldn't see, something apparently standing just beyond that open gate in the darkness of the little fenced green space. Whatever nerve she had left after the bus ride and the missing constable and the long, silent pursuit finally gave out completely at that point. She turned and ran the rest of the way home as fast as she could manage. The dog stopped its frantic barking the moment she began to run, but it didn't abandon her. It fell into pursuit again, keeping pace behind her at a distance of just a few feet this time, close enough that she was certain, looking back on it later, that it could have caught up to her easily if it had wanted to. It never did. It simply stayed there, a few feet back, matching her sprint the entire way to her building, as if its only purpose in that final stretch was to make sure she got there rather than to do her any harm herself. When she reached her building and made it inside, the dog stopped at the entrance and simply watched her go in, standing there in the street as she disappeared through the door and up toward her flat. The moment she got inside, shaken and out of breath, she told my grandfather everything that had just happened. The whole sequence of it, the man on the bus, the missing constable, the dog, the garden, all of it tumbling out at once. He went straight to the window to look out at the street below, expecting to see this enormous black dog still standing guard outside their building the way she described. There was nothing there. No dog anywhere on the street. No sign that anything had been standing outside their building at all. Just the ordinary emptiness of a quiet street at that hour of the night. As though the animal had simply vanished the moment it had done whatever it had set out to do. She barely slept that night, lying awake, going over every detail of what had happened. The bus, The sketchy man, the missing constable, the dog, the garden, turning it all over in her mind and finding no combination of ordinary explanations that fit together neatly. My grandfather, she said, sat up with her for a while too, not fully believing everything at first, gently suggesting that perhaps the dog belonged to someone nearby and had simply been reacting to a cat or some other animal hidden in the garden bushes, some rational explanation that might account for the barking without requiring anything stranger than an ordinary dog behaving like an ordinary dog. She wanted to believe that too, she always said, and for a few hours that night, lying there in the dark, she almost managed to convince herself of it. The following day brought news that made the entire previous night take on a completely different weight. My grandparents learned that the friendly local constable, the same one who had made a habit of meeting my gran off the last bus almost every night, had died the day before of a heart attack. He hadn't been at the stop that night because he was already gone, hours before she'd even left the theater for her shift. A few days after that, further news came through about an incident that had happened elsewhere in the neighborhood that same night. A young woman had been attacked a few streets away from the route my gran normally walked home, and the attack was believed to have happened around 1 in the morning, not long after my gran's own frightening walk home from the bus stop. When she heard the details, my gran said her whole body went cold, because the timing and the location lined up closely enough with the direction the sketchy man from the bus had walked off, in that she couldn't shake the feeling, however unprovable it was, that it might have been the very same man, simply moving on to find a different, less protected target once his first attempt had failed. She never found out for certain whether the two things were connected, whether the man on the bus and whoever had carried out that attack were one and the same person. And the not knowing has always been part of what makes this story sit so uneasily with everyone in our family who's heard it. That particular kind of uncertainty that never fully resolves itself, no matter how many times you turn it over. There was no way back then to confirm something like that, no way to trace it definitively, and the police at the time, still reeling from the sudden loss of one of their own constables, had their hands full without chasing down a connection that existed mostly in the anxious imagination of a young woman who'd had a frightening night. My gran always told this story with a certain quiet seriousness that made it clear she wasn't exaggerating for effect or dressing it up for dramatic purposes the way people sometimes do with old family stories. She genuinely believed, right up until the end of her life, that whatever had guided that dog to her that night, whatever had made it growl so viciously at an empty garden and then escort her the rest of the way home before disappearing without a trace, had something to do with the constable who should have been there to walk her home himself. She never claimed to fully understand it, never tried to explain it away with some tidy supernatural theory, but she always maintained that she didn't think it was a coincidence, not the missing escort, not the dog appearing exactly when it did, not its reaction to that particular garden, and certainly not the timing of everything that came out in the days that followed. She used to say that she never went looking for that dog afterward, never tried to find it or figure out whose it might have been, even though in a neighborhood as tightly knit as theirs was back then, an animal that large would ordinarily have been recognized by somebody. She asked around quietly in the days that followed, mentioning it in passing to neighbors and shopkeepers. But nobody claimed the dog as their own, and nobody else reported seeing a stray of that size wandering the streets that night or any night before or after it. It was as if the dog had existed only for the length of that walk home, and then simply ceased to exist the moment its purpose was fulfilled. What always struck me most, listening to her tell it over the years, wasn't just the strangeness of the dog itself, but the way she described her own reaction changing partway through the story. She said that somewhere between the animal sprinting toward her and then stopping short, and its sudden fierce barking at the empty garden, her fear of the dog had somehow twisted into something closer to trust, an instinct she couldn't fully explain even to herself. She said some part of her understood, even in the middle of all that panic, that whatever it was reacting to inside that garden mattered far more than anything it might have done to her directly, and that its job, whatever strange job it seemed to be carrying out that night, was to get her past that danger, rather than to become one itself. Whenever she told the story, she'd pause right at the end, right after mentioning the attack a few streets over, and just shake her head slowly, letting the silence sit there for a moment before saying quietly that she'd always wondered what might have happened to her that night if that dog hadn't been there. She never had an answer for where it came from or where it went, and neither, all these years later, do the rest of us. All we have is her account of that walk home, told and retold at family gatherings for decades, passed down now to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never had the chance to meet her themselves, and the strange, unshakable feeling it still leaves behind every single time it's told, no matter how many times any of us have already heard it before. Sitting there afterward in the quiet of the room, the way it always used to sit with her. When I was 9 years old, my parents split up, and my dad ended up renting a house in a pretty isolated part of town, the kind of place where you couldn't see a single neighbor no matter which direction you looked. I remember the drive out there for the first time, watching the ordinary suburban streets gradually give way to longer stretches of trees and empty road, wondering the whole way there what this new version of visiting Dad was going to look like now that he wasn't living in the same house as the rest of us anymore. Now that visits meant packing a bag and getting driven somewhere new instead of just walking down the hall to find him. The house was surrounded on almost every side by woods, thick enough that the trees seemed to swallow up the edges of the property, and even though it felt cut off from everything, it was actually a nice area, especially from a kid's point of view. There was space to run around, plenty of nature to explore, and none of the noise or busyness of the neighborhood we'd grown up in with our mom. My dad wasn't living there alone. An old friend of his rented the basement apartment, a guy who had known my dad for years, but who always struck me, even as a kid, as being a little off. He was the kind of person people describe as a neckbeard, deeply into all sorts of mystic and occult interests, always talking about energy and spirits, and things most adults around us treated as nothing more than harmless eccentricity. What made him even more uncomfortable to be around, at least from what I picked up later, was that he'd apparently hit on my mom constantly, back when she and my dad were still together, something that always sat strangely with me once I learned about it, knowing he was still around, still living in that same house, still part of my dad's life even after everything. Upstairs, my dad shared the main part of the house with two other guys. There was Big Frank, this enormous, gentle presence of a man, built like something out of an old Viking story, but with the personality of an oversized teddy bear, who absolutely doted on my little brother and me whenever we came to visit. He was the kind of adult who'd get down on the floor to play whatever ridiculous game we'd invented that weekend, completely unbothered by his own size or dignity, which made him an instant favorite among all of Dad's roommates as far as my brother and I were concerned. Then there was Barney, a stagehand by trade and a deeply religious man by nature, who also seemed to genuinely enjoy having us kids around, always ready to talk to us or include us in whatever he happened to be doing, whether that meant showing us little card tricks or letting us help him with small chores around the house that made us feel important and useful. For a good while after the split, visiting Dad's place felt like nothing but fun. My little brother, who was 5 at the time, and I would spend our weekends running wild through the surrounding woods, playing whatever games we could invent out of sticks and imagination, staying up later than we probably should have, and eating all the junk food that a house full of bachelors tends to keep stocked. It felt, in a lot of ways, like a kind of freedom we didn't get as much of back at our mom's house, and for a long stretch of time, none of us thought twice about anything being wrong with the place. But slowly, so gradually that I couldn't have told you exactly when it started, I began to feel more and more uneasy whenever we were there. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. No single moment or event I could describe if someone had asked me what was wrong. It was just a persistent, creeping sense that something wasn't right about that house. A feeling that settled into the corners of every room and never quite went away, no matter how many times we visited. I remember developing this habit without ever really deciding to, of running to my bed the instant the lights went out at night. Every kid understands this on some instinctive level, that the bed is somehow the one safe place in a dark house. The one spot where nothing can reach you as long as you get there fast enough and pull the blankets up high enough. I did that every single night we stayed at Dad's house, sprinting across the room in the dark, throwing myself under the covers, lying there afterward with my heart pounding. Certain that something was in the room with me, even though I could never see anything when I worked up the nerve to look. I constantly felt like something was there, somewhere just out of sight, watching from whatever shadowed corner happened to be nearest. It's a hard feeling to explain to someone who's never experienced it, that particular certainty that you are not alone in a room, even though every rational part of your mind insists there's nothing there. Sometimes it felt strongest right by the doorway, as though whatever it was like to linger at the threshold rather than fully entering the room, watching from just outside the frame where the hallway light couldn't quite reach it. Other times it felt like it was coming from below, somewhere down near the basement stairs, a heaviness in the air that seemed to seep upward through the floorboards whenever the house went quiet enough for me to notice it. One day, my little brother told me something that confirmed I wasn't the only one feeling it. He said his closet door kept opening on its own in the middle of the night, not swinging open dramatically, not slamming, just slowly creeping open sometime while he slept, so that he'd wake up and find it ajar when he was sure he'd shut it properly before bed. He told me about it in that quiet, matter-of-fact way kids sometimes have when they're describing something frightening, but don't yet have the vocabulary or the confidence to make a big deal out of it. I remember feeling a strange mix of relief and dread hearing him say it. Relief that I wasn't imagining things all on my own. Dread because it meant whatever this was, it was real enough to be affecting both of us separately. We didn't tell our dad about any of this, my brother's closet door, or my own constant sense of being watched. Looking back, I think it's because Dad, during that particular period of his life, wasn't especially good at listening to us kids, caught up as he was in his own struggles following the divorce, and we both had a pretty strong instinct that he wouldn't take something like this seriously, even if we worked up the courage to bring it to him. There was also, I think, a quieter fear underneath that one. The worry that saying it out loud to him might somehow make it more real than it already felt. That keeping it between just the two of us was safer somehow. Instead, we told Barney. Something about him felt safer to confide in. Maybe because of his religious background. Maybe just because he'd always been kind and attentive to us in a way that made him feel approachable, even about something as strange as this. When we told him what we'd been experiencing, my constant unease in my brother's closet door, Barney didn't laugh it off or tell us we were imagining things. He said, quite seriously, that he had felt something evil in the house himself, something he hadn't wanted to alarm us with unless we brought it up first, and he told us he'd do something about it. True to his word, one day when everyone else had left the house, Barney went through the rooms sprinkling holy water, lighting candles, and saying prayers, going through what I can only assume was some version of a blessing or a cleansing ritual based on his own faith. He never fully explained the details of what he was doing or why, and we never asked, trusting that whatever tradition he was drawing on, he knew it well enough and took it seriously enough that it was worth letting him handle it in his own way, without us interfering or peppering him with questions. When my brother and I got back to the house that evening, it genuinely did feel different, lighter somehow. The oppressive sense of being watched noticeably thinner in the air than it had been before. I remember walking through the front door that night and immediately noticing the difference. The way you notice when a headache you'd gotten so used to finally lifts, leaving behind a kind of clarity you'd almost forgotten was possible. That relief didn't last, though. By the very next weekend we visited, the house had gone right back to feeling creepy and awful, as though whatever Barney had managed to push back had simply seeped back into the walls the moment enough time had passed. And that became the pattern for the rest of our time visiting that house. Barney's cleansing would help for a little while, and then the unease would creep back in, and we'd all just quietly endure it until the next time he decided to try again. This went on for years. My dad ended up living in that house for 5 years total before he finally moved out, and for the entire length of that time, my brother and I just put up with the creepiness, pretending, at least to each other and to the adults around us, that we weren't as scared as we really were. We even developed our own private routines around it without ever really discussing them out loud. Little habits like always leaving a hallway light on, or making sure we walked into rooms together rather than separately whenever we could manage it. Small precautions that felt silly to name directly, but that both of us kept up anyway, year after year, without either of us ever needing to explain why. It's a strange thing, looking back on it now, how easy it becomes to tolerate something unsettling as long as it never escalates into anything you can point to directly. As long as nothing actually happened to either of us, no visible threat, no direct confrontation with whatever was causing that feeling, we found we could simply live alongside it, weekend after weekend, year after year, treating it almost like background noise rather than something worth making a fuss about. A couple of summers ago, long after all of that, I ended up moving in with my dad and my stepmom for a while during a stretch of schooling. He'd gotten remarried about a year after finally moving out of that old isolated house, and by this point, that whole chapter of our childhood felt distant enough that it mostly came up only in the context of funny old stories, rather than anything genuinely unsettling. One particularly nice evening, the three of us were sitting around together, playing some kind of game and having a few beers, enjoying the kind of relaxed, easy evening that families settle into once enough time has passed and enough wounds have healed. At some point, my stepmom brought up that old house, mentioning offhand how filthy it always must have been with a bunch of bachelors living there together, no wife or mother figure around to keep things in order. We all laughed at that, and the conversation drifted naturally into reminiscing about the old roommates, Big Frank and his gentle giant presence, the neckbeard downstairs and his strange mystic obsessions, Barney and his quiet, steady faith, and all the wacky, ordinary things that tend to happen when a group of grown men share a house together. Somewhere in the middle of all that easy laughter and nostalgia, I decided to bring up the thing my brother and I had never really talked about with Dad directly. Not back then, and not since. I said, casually, the way you'd mention any old memory, Bro and I were sure that place was haunted or something. He says his closet door opened in the middle of the night. I never saw anything weird myself, but God, that place was creepy. I expected a laugh, maybe some gentle teasing about our overactive childhood imaginations. Instead, my dad just nodded slowly, his expression shifting into something more serious than I had anticipated. Yeah, he said, there was some kind of evil presence there. He paused for a moment, and then he told us something he said he'd never shared with either of us kids before. He said that he'd been pushed down the stairs multiple times over the years while heading down to the basement to do laundry, shoved hard enough from behind that he'd nearly broken bones more than once, even though he was always completely alone in the house whenever it happened, with no one behind him who could have physically done it. And then he mentioned one particular time he'd walked into the kitchen and found every single knife from the block embedded in the ceiling, driven up into the plaster with a force that no ordinary person could have managed by throwing them from below, arranged there as if something had simply placed them there directly rather than launched them. The table went quiet after he said that. My stepmom, who'd never lived in that house herself and had only ever heard secondhand stories about it before that night, looked almost as unsettled as I felt, hearing it confirmed so plainly, so calmly, by the one adult who'd spent 5 full years living inside whatever that house actually was. She asked him gently why he'd never mentioned any of it before, and he just shrugged, saying he figured nobody would have believed him, and that by the time he might have felt comfortable bringing it up, he'd already moved out and it had started to feel like something better left in the past, something he'd rather forget about than keep dragging back into conversation. All those years, my brother and I had assumed we were the only ones who'd sensed something wrong, quietly enduring it on our own because we didn't think Dad would believe us even if we tried to explain it, never once suspecting that the very person we were protecting ourselves from disappointing was carrying the exact same secret in exactly the same silent way, night after night, weekend after weekend, right alongside us the entire time. It never once occurred to either of us that he'd been living through his own version of it the entire time, silently, just as convinced as we were that nobody would take it seriously if he brought it up. It's strange to think about now, 3 people under one roof, each one certain something was deeply wrong, each one keeping quiet out of the same fear of not being taken seriously, when all along we could have simply talked to each other and realized we weren't alone in what we were feeling. I think about that conversation a lot now, the strange symmetry of it. 3 separate people in that house, my brother, myself, and my dad, all independently certain that something wasn't right. All keeping it to ourselves for years out of the same quiet fear of not being believed. It makes me wonder how many families end up in situations like that without ever realizing it. Everyone under the same roof quietly enduring the exact same thing. Each person assuming they're carrying it alone simply because nobody wants to be the first to say something out loud and risk sounding foolish. Or worse, risk being the reason everyone else finally has to admit it's real too. Barney had sensed it too, strongly enough to act on it more than once, with his prayers and his holy water, buying us all a few days of peace before whatever it was crept back in. Whatever that house actually was, whatever had been pushing my dad down those basement stairs and driving knives into the kitchen ceiling and creaking open my brother's closet door in the dead of night. It seems fairly clear now that none of us imagined it, and that all of us, in our own separate ways, spent 5 long years simply learning to live alongside something none of us ever really understood. Sometimes I wonder about the neckbeard downstairs, too, whether his interest in mystic things had anything to do with whatever lived in that house. Whether he'd sensed it long before any of the rest of us and simply never said anything, content to study it from a distance rather than confront it the way Barney tried to, or whether he'd simply been drawn to that strange energy in the first place and had chosen the basement apartment because of it rather than in spite of it. We never asked him, and he moved away not long after Dad finally left the place, drifting out of our lives the way old roommates sometimes do once the shared address that connected everyone disappears. I don't know if he ever felt what the rest of us felt, or if his strange interests were simply a coincidence layered on top of everything else that made that house feel wrong. Either way, none of us have ever gone back to see what that house looks like now, and honestly, I don't think any of us particularly want to. Not even out of simple curiosity. Not even after all these years of distance from it. My school's library used to stay open until around 2 in the morning, mostly for people like me who had a habit of putting off essays until the absolute last possible night before they were due. It wasn't a huge building, nothing like the massive university libraries you see in movies, but it did have this one section that most students avoided unless they absolutely had to go down there. A basement area everyone just called the stacks. Before I get into what happened, it helps to understand the layout of the place a little, because the geography of that basement ends up mattering a lot to the story. I should also mention up front that I've told this story before to a fair number of people, so if it sounds familiar, that's probably why. To get down to the stacks, you had to take this wide main staircase from the main floor of the library. The kind of staircase that echoed loudly, no matter how quietly you tried to walk down it. At the bottom, there was a small room with a couple of vending machines, more or less the last normal, well-lit space before you got into the actual book stacks themselves. From there, a long hallway stretched out with 4 separate entrances leading into 2 enormous rooms on opposite sides of that hallway. Each one lined wall to wall with tall bookshelves and a scattering of study desks tucked in between them. The rooms themselves were big, much bigger than you'd expect from the modest size of the building above ground, with shelves stretching back far enough that if you were sitting at a desk near the front, you genuinely couldn't see all the way to the back of the room without getting up and walking through the stacks yourself. I'd been down to the stacks plenty of times before that night, always during more reasonable hours, usually in the afternoon with plenty of other students scattered around the room. The low hum of quiet conversation and shuffling papers filling the space in a way that made the size of it feel less imposing. I don't think I'd ever actually been down there alone at night before. Not really alone in the sense of having the room to essentially just myself and one other stranger, and looking back, I think that difference mattered more than I appreciated in the moment. During the day, that basement felt like any other part of the library. At night, with the lighting dimmer in certain corners and most of the overhead fixtures switched off to save on energy costs after a certain hour, it took on a completely different character. One I hadn't really registered until I was sitting there alone, with nothing but the hum of the vending machines down the hall for company. Last year, I found myself down there around 11 at night, working on an essay that required a lot of research, the kind where you actually need physical books rather than just internet sources, and it made more sense to set up camp at one of the study desks in the stacks rather than keep hauling books up and down the stairs every time I needed something new. I'd claimed one of the desks that sat somewhat centrally in the room, close enough to the shelves that I could grab reference books without walking too far, but still within reasonable view of the hallway entrances. Little things like that mattered more than usual that night, since I knew I'd be down there for hours and didn't want to keep making unnecessary trips back and forth between floors while the clock kept ticking toward my deadline. By around 11, I had already been down there for a solid 2 hours, deep enough into the research that the rest of the world had started to blur a little, the way it does when you're staring at the same pages for too long, trying to squeeze out enough material for a paper that's due first thing in the morning. Slowly, over the course of that evening, everyone else who'd been working down there earlier had packed up and left, until it was just me and one other guy. A boy working a few desks down from where I was sitting. Both of us clearly in the same last-minute essay boat, exchanging the occasional tired glance whenever one of us sighed loudly enough for the other to notice. Neither of us had spoken directly. Just the kind of silent camaraderie that exists between two strangers pulling the same kind of late night, both too tired and too focused to bother with small talk, but still somehow aware of each other's presence the whole time. I was pretty zoned out by that point in the night, running on the particular kind of frantic focus that comes from having an 8 a.m. class the essay was due for, and not nearly enough time left to finish it properly. So when I started hearing someone flipping through book pages really fast, loud enough to produce that distinctive whirring noise pages make when someone's rapidly fanning through them, it irritated me more than it probably should have under normal circumstances. It was coming from the far end of the room, somewhere back among the shelves where I couldn't actually see anyone. At first, I just tried to ignore it, assuming whoever it was would get bored or find whatever page they were looking for and stop soon enough. I had too much of my own work left to deal with to want to get up and confront a stranger over some noise, especially not with the clock ticking down toward morning the way it was. But the flipping didn't stop. It kept going, on and off, that same rapid whirring sound, minute after minute, and my patience wore thinner with every repetition. After about 5 minutes of this, I finally reached the point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I got up from my desk, fully intending to walk over and politely but firmly ask whoever it was to knock it off, since we clearly weren't alone enough in that room for that kind of noise to go unnoticed or unaddressed. I made it maybe 3 steps across the room in that direction when the noise simply stopped. All at once, mid-flip it seemed like, cutting off with no natural taper the way sound usually does when a person just finishes what they were doing and closes a book. I stood there for a second, waiting to see if it would start back up now that I'd interrupted whatever rhythm it had going, but the room stayed quiet. Feeling a little foolish, standing in the middle of an empty aisle of bookshelves for no reason, I turned around and sat back down at my desk, chalking the whole thing up to some student I simply hadn't noticed. Someone who'd probably clocked me getting up and had decided to quietly finish up and move somewhere else in the room without me seeing them do it. It stayed quiet for about 10 more minutes, long enough that I'd mostly forgotten about the whole thing and gotten back into a decent rhythm with my own work. And then the flipping started again. Except this time, it was much louder than before, loud enough that it startled me out of whatever paragraph I'd been in the middle of writing. The kind of volume you'd expect if someone had grabbed an enormous book, something thick and heavy, and was fanning through its pages with real force behind it. At this point, the other boy in the room had clearly had enough too. I saw him push back from his desk with obvious frustration and stand up, immediately heading toward the shelves in the direction the noise was coming from, clearly intent on tracking down whoever was making it and putting a stop to it once and for all. Seeing him get up gave me a bit of courage, or maybe just made me feel less ridiculous about doing the same thing. So I got up as well and started walking through the shelves alongside him, each of us taking a different row to cover more ground. The noise kept going the whole time we searched, if anything getting even louder and more insistent as we got closer to whatever section it seemed to be coming from, and by that point it was pretty obvious which general area of the room it was originating from. We split up along either side of the tall shelving units, him working one side, me working the other, both of us walking slowly down the length of the aisles, scanning for whoever was responsible, expecting at any moment to round a corner and find some other student we simply hadn't noticed earlier in the night, headphones in, completely oblivious to how loud they'd been being. We walked the entire length of those shelves, all the way down and back, checking every gap between bookcases, every little nook where a person could conceivably be sitting or standing while flipping through a book. There was no one there. Not a single other person in that entire section of the room. Nothing that would explain where that sound had been coming from, just moments before. I even crouched down at one point to check under a couple of the lower shelves, half expecting to find some kid pulling a bizarre prank, hiding down there, giggling at how spooked we clearly were. But there was nothing, just dust and the usual clutter of stray bookmarks and forgotten pencils that tend to accumulate under library furniture over the years. What made it even stranger was the layout of the room itself. We were on the side of the stacks closest to the hallway entrances, the same entrances we'd both been sitting near for hours, close enough that neither of us could have missed someone walking in without noticing. There was no back door, no other way into that room that either of us knew about, and certainly no way for someone to slip past both of us without either of us catching sight of them at some point during the evening. Whoever or whatever had been making that noise, they hadn't come in through any door we knew about, and they weren't standing anywhere in that room by the time we'd finished searching it. The noise had stopped again by the time we gave up looking, the room settling back into that same heavy quiet it had been sitting in before any of this started. We exchanged a look, some mixture of confusion and unease passing between us without either of us really saying anything about it directly, and eventually we both just sort of slowly made our way back toward our respective desks. I remember telling myself, somewhat unconvincingly, even as I thought it, that it was probably just some kind of vent or fan system somewhere in the building, making a noise that only sounded like pages flipping if you weren't paying close enough attention. I had an essay due in a matter of hours and told myself I really didn't have the time or the mental energy to keep chasing down some phantom noise instead of finishing my work. We both sat back down at our desks, and almost the instant we did, the noise started up again. Except this time, it sounded like it was coming from somewhere right next to the other boy's chair, close enough that he practically jumped where he sat, his whole body flinching in a way that told me he'd felt it just as strongly as I had, that unmistakable sense of something being immediately uncomfortably near. He didn't waste any time deliberating about it. I watched him shove his laptop and books into his bag in a matter of seconds, movements quick and a little frantic. And then he looked directly at me and said, with total conviction, "Fuck this." And then he was gone, moving fast toward the hallway and the stairs leading back up to the main floor, not bothering to look back or say anything else. I remember his chair actually toppling over slightly behind him from the speed he got up at, clattering against the floor and rolling a few inches before settling. A small detail that stuck with me for some reason, even though it was hardly the most important part of what was happening in that moment. I wasn't far behind him. Whatever calm rationalizing I'd been doing just moments earlier about vents and fans completely evaporated the second I saw how genuinely spooked he was. And some deep instinctive part of my brain decided that finishing an essay was not worth whatever might happen if I stayed down there alone with that noise for even a few more minutes. I grabbed my things in what felt like record time and was out of that room maybe 5 seconds behind him, taking the stairs back up 2 at a time, not slowing down until I was back on the main floor of the library where the lighting was normal and other people were still around. My hands were shaking a little by the time I reached the top, and it took me a solid minute standing in the middle of the main reading room, surrounded by the ordinary hum of the after-hours front desk staff, before my heart rate came back down to something reasonable. I ended up finishing that essay somewhere else that night, hunched over a laptop at my kitchen table with far fewer research materials than I would have liked, turning in something that probably wasn't my best work, but that felt like a perfectly reasonable trade for not having to go back down into that basement again that night. I never did find out what that noise actually was, never ran into that same boy again to compare notes or figure out if he'd experienced anything else like it before or since. And honestly, I've never particularly wanted to look into it further than I already have, no matter how many times friends have pushed me to try to dig deeper or find some kind of closure to the whole thing. I've thought about it a lot since then, turning the whole sequence of events over in my head, trying to find some rational explanation that fits all the pieces. It's not that I couldn't believe a fan or some piece of building equipment might occasionally make a strange sound. It's that everything about the timing felt too deliberate, too responsive to what we were doing in the moment. The way it stopped the instant I got up to confront it. The way it waited exactly long enough for us to sit back down and relax before starting up again, louder each time. The way it seemed to track our movements through the room, always managing to be somewhere we'd just checked rather than somewhere we were currently searching, as though it knew exactly which rows we'd already cleared and was staying carefully one step ahead of us the entire time. None of that behavior matches anything mechanical I've ever heard of. And believe me, I've tried to convince myself otherwise more times than I can count. I did some digging afterward cautiously, mostly just searching around online late at night when I couldn't sleep, wondering if anyone else had experienced something similar in a library setting, or if there was some kind of documented history tied to that particular building that might explain what we'd gone through. I didn't find anything specific to my own school. No ghost stories floating around online that matched what happened to us, though I did come across plenty of general accounts from other people describing strange sounds and unexplainable page-turning noises in library basements and archive rooms elsewhere. Enough that it made me wonder if there's something about that particular kind of space. Quiet, full of paper, cut off from the rest of a building, that seems to attract this specific kind of phenomenon more than other places do. I even asked one of the older librarians once, framing it as idle curiosity rather than admitting what had actually happened, whether the building had any kind of history worth knowing about. She just gave me a strange, knowing sort of smile and said every old building has stories if you ask around enough, and left it at that, never elaborating any further no matter how I tried to steer the conversation back toward specifics, changing the subject instead to ask whether I'd found everything I needed for my research that week, as though the matter was already closed as far as she was concerned. Even now, months and months later, I still won't go down into the stacks at night, not even when there are other people already down there working. If I need a book from that section after dark, I make myself do without it, or wait until the next morning when there's a reasonable crowd of people around and the daylight is coming through whatever windows exist down there, thin as it usually is at that hour. I still haven't gone back in there after dark since that night, and I don't think I ever will, no matter how many semesters go by or how much the memory of it fades around the edges over time. It doesn't matter how badly I need a source or how close a deadline is creeping. No essay is worth whatever might be waiting down there in the dark, flipping through pages with nobody's hands to hold the book, patient enough to wait through 10 quiet minutes before starting up again, just a little louder, a little closer, each and every single time it happened. Before I get into the actual story about the man with the suitcase, I need to give a little background first, because the context matters a lot to how unsettling the whole thing turned out to be. Many years ago, back when I first met the woman who would eventually become my ex, she and her family were living in a mobile home. It wasn't anything unusual as far as living situations go, just a modest, single-wide setup out in a fairly quiet area. The kind of home a lot of families end up in when they're working with a tight budget and don't need a lot of extra space. My ex had a younger sister, and I want to be careful in how I talk about her, because she genuinely struggled with some serious mental health issues over the years. The kind of struggles that led to multiple stays in psychiatric facilities at different points in her life. I don't say that to be dismissive of her or to suggest her experiences don't matter. I say it because it's relevant to how the family treated what she used to describe as a kid. And honestly, it's relevant to how I thought about the story myself for a long time before everything that happened later completely changed my perspective on it. She was a few years younger than my ex, close enough in age that they'd shared plenty of childhood experiences together, but different enough in temperament that my ex had always described her sister as the more sensitive, more easily overwhelmed of the two of them, even before anyone in the family had a name for whatever was going on with her mentally. Back in that mobile home, my ex and her younger sister shared a bedroom, the way siblings close in age often do when space is limited. While my ex and I were still dating, long before our son was ever born, she told me this particular story about her sister one evening, almost as a kind of passing family anecdote. The sort of thing you bring up when you're getting to know someone's family history and trying to fill in the picture of what their childhood looked like. According to my ex, her younger sister used to wake up in the middle of the night and start talking to a man who would appear standing in the hallway just outside their shared bedroom door. She described this man in oddly specific terms for something that was supposedly just the product of an overactive imagination, or later. Attributed to whatever mental health struggles the sister was already starting to show signs of, even as a young kid. The man always had a suitcase with him, apparently, and always wore a hat with a wide brim, the kind of old-fashioned look you'd associate with an earlier era, rather than anything a modern kid would typically imagine on their own if they were just making up an imaginary friend from scratch. My ex and the rest of her family never took it seriously. As far as they were concerned, the younger sister was already exhibiting signs of whatever was going on with her mentally, and this was just one more strange thing on a growing list of strange things she'd say or do, easily filed away under the general category of the sister being, in their words, a bit nuts. Nobody in the family ever expressed any real concern about a man in the hallway specifically, no lingering unease about it as an actual presence in the house. It was simply absorbed into the larger, sadder narrative of a young girl who was struggling and who said unusual things as a symptom of that struggle. Nothing more. I remember hearing the story that first time and reacting about the same way. It was a strange little detail. Sure, a man with a suitcase and a hat standing in a trailer hallway late at night, but it fit neatly enough into what I already understood about her sister's situation that I didn't think much more about it beyond a passing, slightly uncomfortable feeling before moving on to whatever we were talking about next. It became, for me too, just one more piece of context about my girlfriend's complicated family situation, filed away and mostly forgotten. Flash forward a few years. By that point, my ex and I had a son together, and life had moved forward in the way it does, with all its usual changes and transitions. Her parents ended up moving out of that same mobile home and into an actual house elsewhere, and instead of selling or getting rid of the trailer, they arranged for my ex to rent it from them, which worked out well for us at the time, given our own financial situation and need for affordable housing while we figured out our next steps as a young family. Here's the detail that still gets me every time I think back on it. When we moved into that mobile home ourselves, our son ended up with the exact same bedroom that my ex and her sister had shared all those years earlier. It wasn't something we planned or thought carefully about at the time, just the natural result of how the rooms in the trailer were laid out, and which one made the most sense for a toddler's bedroom given its size and location relative to the rest of the home. At the time, if I even remembered the old story about the man in the hallway at all, it certainly wasn't at the front of my mind while we were setting up our son's crib and arranging his little collection of toys and blankets in that room. One particular night sticks with me more than any other from that period. Our son had already gone to bed, and he'd been asleep for a good while by that point, long enough that I'd actually gotten up at one point to check on him quietly, peeking in to make sure he was settled and breathing easily the way you do as a new parent, still getting used to that particular kind of low-level vigilance that comes with having a small child in the house. Everything had looked completely normal. He was sound asleep, sprawled out the way toddlers tend to sleep, blankets half kicked off, one arm hanging over the edge of his little bed. Later that same night, while my ex and I were sitting in the living room doing whatever ordinary thing we happened to be doing at that hour, we heard him get out of bed. The sound was unmistakable. That particular soft thump and shuffle of small feet hitting the floor and moving across the room. A sound we'd both grown familiar enough with over the months that neither of us needed to say anything to know exactly what it meant. Our first assumption, the reasonable, ordinary assumption any parent would make, was that he was about to come padding out of his room to ask to use the potty, something that happened fairly often at that age as he was still working through the whole potty training process. Instead of coming out of his room, though, he started talking. Not the vague, half-asleep mumbling you sometimes hear from kids adjusting their position in bed, but clear, deliberate talking. The kind of speech pattern he used when he was genuinely engaging with someone, having an actual back-and-forth exchange rather than just narrating something to himself in that private, meandering way toddlers sometimes do when they think no one's listening. We heard him say hi in that bright, casual way toddlers greet people they're comfortable with. And then he launched into talking about his favorite stuffed animal, which at the time was a little stuffed duck he'd nicknamed Ducky and carried around with him basically everywhere, sleeping with it every single night without exception. He was chattering away about Ducky in the enthusiastic, slightly rambling way small kids talk about their favorite things, describing whatever thoughts happened to be running through his head about that duck at that particular moment. Curious about who exactly he thought he was talking to, since as far as we knew there was nobody else in that room or anywhere nearby in the trailer, I called out to him and asked who he was talking to. I didn't think much of it in that moment, genuinely expecting some innocent, easily explainable answer, maybe that he was talking to Ducky himself, personifying the stuffed animal the way plenty of toddlers do with their favorite toys, treating them almost like actual conversational partners rather than inanimate objects. He popped his head out of his bedroom doorway then, this small, sleepy silhouette appearing in the hallway light, and informed us in that same casual, matter-of-fact tone toddlers use when stating something they consider completely obvious and unremarkable, that he was talking to the man with a suitcase, the one wearing a hat. I remember the exact feeling that washed over me in that moment, a cold, prickling sensation that started at the back of my neck and spread down through my shoulders almost instantly. My ex, sitting right there beside me, went pale in a way I'd never quite seen her go pale before, her whole body going rigid as the words left our son's mouth. It's strange, looking back, how something so small, a 2-year-old casually describing a man in a hallway, could produce such an immediate, physical reaction in both of us at the exact same time, without either of us needing to say a single word to the other to know we were both thinking the exact same terrible thought. Because at that point, our son was only about 2.5 years old. He had never once heard the story about his aunt, my ex's younger sister, seeing a man with a suitcase and a hat in that exact same hallway, all those years earlier, in that exact same trailer, in what turned out to be the exact same bedroom. There was no possible way, as far as either of us could figure, that he could have picked up that specific description on his own. We hadn't told him the story, obviously, since it wasn't exactly appropriate material for a toddler, and even if we had somehow talked about it within earshot without realizing he was listening. A suitcase and a wide-brimmed hat aren't the kind of details a 2.5-year-old would typically retain and repeat back with that level of specific, casual confidence, describing a stranger as though he were simply mentioning a familiar visitor rather than inventing something out of thin air. My ex and I sat there for a long moment after he said it, just staring at each other, both of us clearly processing the exact same realization at the exact same time. She was the one who finally broke the silence, her voice shaky, reminding me of the story she told me years earlier about her sister, about how their family had always written it off as just another symptom of the sister's ongoing struggles, never once considering that there might have actually been something real standing in that hallway the whole time. Something that had apparently been there long before either of our kids had ever been born, patiently waiting in that same narrow strip of hallway for whichever child happened to occupy that particular bedroom next. We went into his room together after that, both of us, checking every corner, opening the closet, even checking under his little bed, feeling slightly ridiculous, doing it but unable to stop ourselves, given what we'd just heard. There was nothing there, of course, nothing visible anyway. Just our son standing in the doorway, looking mildly confused about why both his parents were suddenly so intent on checking every corner of his room instead of just sending him back to bed the way they normally would have. I remember running my hand along the back wall of that closet, half expecting to feel something. Some cold spot or draft that might explain the whole thing away as a house with a bad seal somewhere, letting in wind that could somehow be misread as a voice by an imaginative toddler. But there was nothing. Just ordinary drywall and the faint smell of the cheap paint the previous owners had used on it years earlier. We asked him a few gentle questions about the man, trying not to sound too alarmed in front of him, not wanting to frighten a 2.5-year-old over something we ourselves weren't even sure how to process. He described the man again in that same simple, unbothered way, repeating the suitcase, repeating the hat, adding only that the man was quiet and didn't say very much back to him, mostly just listened, while our son talked about Ducky and whatever other things had been on his young mind that night. After that, we ended up moving him into a different bedroom within the trailer, one on the opposite side of the home. And we never fully explained to him why we'd made the switch, telling him only that we thought he might like the bigger window in the new room better. From that point on, he never mentioned the man with the suitcase again, at least not that we ever heard, and life slowly went back to its normal rhythm of toddler tantrums and bedtime routines and the ordinary business of raising a small child. I've thought about that night more times than I can count in the years since, turning it over in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation that would make everything fit together neatly. I've considered whether maybe our son had somehow overheard the story despite our best efforts to keep that particular family history away from him, whether some cousin or relative might have mentioned it in passing within his earshot at some family gathering we weren't fully paying attention to. But even accounting for that possibility, it still wouldn't explain the coincidence of it happening in that exact same room, in that exact same hallway, with our son using nearly the identical description his aunt had used years before he was even born. I've also gone back and forth over the years on whether there might be some more mundane explanation tied to the trailer itself. Something about its structure or its history that I've never fully looked into. I asked my ex's parents about it once, carefully, trying not to alarm them, whether they knew anything about who might have lived in or owned that trailer before their family moved in, whether there was any history attached to the property that might explain a recurring figure like that showing up to two different children years apart. They didn't have much to offer. It had been a fairly ordinary rental property before they bought it. Nothing dramatic in its history as far as they knew, no stories of previous tragedy or anything else that might obviously explain a lingering presence. That lack of an answer has bothered me almost as much as the original incident itself, honestly, because it means I've never had anything solid to hang the explanation on beyond the plain fact that it happened, twice, to two different children in the exact same spot. My ex's younger sister, when we eventually told her about what our son had said, years after the fact, once she'd stabilized quite a bit, and was in a much better place mentally, had an interesting reaction. She wasn't surprised at all. She told us she'd always known the man was real, that she'd never once doubted what she was seeing back when she was a kid, sharing that room with her older sister, no matter how many times her own family dismissed it as just another symptom of whatever was going on with her at the time. Hearing that our son had described the exact same figure in the exact same location felt to her like a kind of vindication, a confirmation of something she'd carried around as an unproven, dismissed part of her own childhood for years. Something she said she'd stopped mentioning to anyone a long time ago, simply because she'd gotten so tired of the way people's faces changed whenever she brought it up. We don't live in that trailer anymore, and my son, now much older, doesn't remember any of it. The man, the hallway, Ducky the stuffed duck, none of it. It's become one of those stories that exists now purely in the memory of the adults involved, something my ex and I bring up quietly to each other from time to time, usually late at night, usually when the house is quiet in that particular way that makes a person's mind wander toward things they'd rather not think about too closely. I sometimes wonder whether whoever moved into that trailer after us ever experienced anything similar, whether some other small child ended up in that same bedroom and eventually said hello to the exact same man in the exact same hallway, describing the same suitcase, the same hat, to parents who had no idea what they were about to hear. I've thought about reaching out to find out, tracking down whoever rents that trailer now, but every time I consider it, I decide against it, telling myself that whatever answer I might get probably wouldn't bring me any real peace either way. Whoever or whatever that man with the suitcase actually was, he seemed content simply appearing to whichever child happened to occupy that room, quiet and undemanding, waiting patiently in that same narrow hallway for as long as it took for the right small voice to say hello back to him.